Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that lingers in the cold silence between the stars, one that the lords of the Imperium would rather not answer, one that the Elder whisper about in the flickering wraithbone halls of their dying craft worlds, and one that even the cold, calculating minds of the Necron dynasties have been forced to consider more than once across the long millennia of their ancient existence. It is a question that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it, almost laughable, the kind of thing a junior scribe might mumble during his first briefing on Xenos threats before being quietly corrected by his superiors. The question is this: what if the greatest danger to every living thing in this galaxy is not the howling madness of the warp, not the soul-devouring hunger of the tyrannid hive fleets, not even the slow reawakening of the Necron tomb worlds? What if the real threat, the one that has been here longer than almost any other, the one that has already come closer to destroying the Imperium of man than Horus himself ever did, is the Orks? Now, I know what you might be thinking. The Orks, those loud, green-skinned brutes who cobble together weapons from scrap metal and seem more interested in punching each other than conquering the galaxy. The ones who paint their vehicles red because they genuinely believe it makes them go faster. Surely not. Surely they are just a nuisance, a persistent problem to be managed, a green tide that rises and falls like some cosmic weather pattern, destructive but ultimately predictable, ultimately controllable. And that, right there, and is the most dangerous assumption anyone has ever made about the Orks. That assumption has cost the Imperium more worlds, more soldiers, more irreplaceable resources than nearly any other strategic miscalculation in 10,000 years of warfare. It is an assumption that has led entire planetary defense forces to lower their guard, that has caused fleet admirals to redirect warships to other fronts, and that has allowed small orc infestations to bloom into full-scale invasions that swallowed entire sectors before anyone realized what was happening. So settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are going to talk about the Orks. Not the comedic relief version, not the cartoonish brutes that provide a bit of dark humor in an otherwise relentlessly grim setting. We are going to talk about what the Orks actually are, where they actually came from, what they are actually capable of, and why, when you strip away the funny accents and the ridiculous contraptions and the headlong charges into withering gunfire, you are left with something that should terrify every thinking being in the galaxy. We are going to trace their story from the very beginning, from an age so distant that the stars themselves were young, and the galaxy was a battlefield for beings whose power dwarfed anything that exists today. We are going to follow them through 60 million years of existence, through the rise and fall of civilizations, through the birth and death of empires, all the way to the present day, where the largest gathering of Orks the galaxy has seen in millennia is slowly, inexorably gathering momentum under the banner of a single, terrifyingly visionary warlord. By the time we are done, I think you will agree with me. The Orks are not just a threat. They are, perhaps, the threat, the one that was designed to be unstoppable, the one that was built to outlast everything else. The one that has been slowly, patiently, and without anyone really noticing, winning the longest war in the history of the universe. Let us begin where all things begin in this galaxy. In the darkness before the dawn, in the silence before the first scream, in the ancient and terrible conflict that shaped everything that came after. Let us begin with the war in heaven. 60 million years ago, give or take a few geological epochs, the galaxy was a very different place. The stars burned just as bright. The void between them was just as cold. But the civilizations that walked beneath those distant suns were of a kind that the modern galaxy can barely comprehend. This was the age of the Old Ones, a race so ancient and so powerful that even calling them a race feels like an understatement. They were something closer to architects of reality itself, beings who had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe and used that mastery to shape the galaxy according to their vision. The Old Ones were reptilian in nature, Or at least that is the best approximation that modern imperial scholars have been able to determine from the fragmentary evidence that remains. What we know for certain is that they were the first great civilization to arise in the Milky Way, and that their understanding of the warp, the dimension of psychic energy that underlies physical reality, was unparalleled. They did not merely use the warp, they shaped it, traveled through it, built within it. The webway, that labyrinthine network of tunnels through the Imperium that the Eldar would later inherit, and the Emperor of Mankind would one day attempt to replicate, was their creation. But more relevantly for our purposes tonight, the Old Ones were creators of life. They did not simply observe the evolution of species across the galaxy. They guided it. They accelerated it. They engineered entire races from the ground up, designing them for specific purposes, embedding knowledge and abilities directly into their genetic code with a precision that makes even the gene crafting of the Emperor seem crude by comparison. The Eldar were one such creation. A psychically gifted species designed to be attuned to the warp and capable of wielding its energies with grace and sophistication. But the Eldar were not the only weapon the Old Ones forged. Because the Old Ones were fighting a war, the First Great War, a conflict that would determine the fate of the entire galaxy for millions of years to come. And in that war, they needed more than graceful psychers and subtle manipulators. They needed soldiers. They needed brutes. They needed something that could be pointed at an enemy and trusted to keep fighting until either it or the enemy was dead. Something that did not need supply lines or sophisticated logistics or careful morale management. Something that would fight because fighting was encoded into its very cells. They needed the Krork. The enemy the Old Ones faced was the Necrontyre, a civilization of short-lived, bitter beings who had turned to the star gods, known as the Satan, for salvation from their own mortality. The bargain they struck was a terrible one. The Satan consumed the Necrontyre's souls and rebuilt their bodies in living metal, transforming them into the Necrons, an army of deathless automatons wielding technology that could unmake the very fabric of reality. The Satan, now fed and empowered by the souls of an entire species, turned their terrible gaze upon the Old Ones. And the war in heaven began. It was a conflict of staggering scale. Entire star systems were extinguished. Suns were weaponized. The barriers between the physical universe and the warp were stressed and strained until they began to crack. The Old Ones, for all their power, had found themselves fighting for survival against enemies who could not die, who did not tire, who felt neither fear nor mercy. Their elegant psychic warriors were devastating, certainly, but they were not enough. The Necrons kept coming. The Satan kept feeding. And so the Old Ones, in what may have been their most desperate and most brilliant act of creation, engineered the Krork. Now, to understand what the Krork were, you need to forget everything you think you know about the modern Orks. The Krork were not the squabbling, disorganized, relatively small greenskins that the Imperium deals with today. According to the records that have survived, records found in Necron tomb worlds, and in the fractured memories of the most ancient Eldar seers, the Krork were enormous. Yet we are talking about beings that stood as tall as 12 meters in some cases, towering over even the largest space marines the way an adult towers over a toddler. They wore sophisticated power armor that would have been impressive, even by the standards of the Imperium during the Horus Heresy, tens of millions of years later. Their weapons were advanced, reliable, and devastatingly effective. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for the original power of the Krork comes from a most unlikely source. The eccentric Necron overlord, known as Trazyn the Infinite, who maintains a vast collection of curiosities from across time and space in his galleries on the world of Solemnas, is known to possess a Krork specimen held in stasis. When a force of the Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines stumbled upon this specimen during the events recounted in the novel about Fabius Bile, they were taken aback by its sheer scale and the quality of its equipment. This was no crude brute cobbled together from scrap. This was a sophisticated war machine in every sense of the phrase. a being designed by the greatest bioengineers the galaxy has ever known to be the ultimate infantry soldier. The Old Ones had embedded everything the Krork would need directly into their genetic code. Technical knowledge for building weapons and machines was hardwired into the DNA of specialized castes, so that a Krork could instinctively construct, maintain, and operate complex technology without ever being formally taught. Medical knowledge was similarly encoded, so that battlefield injuries could be treated by specialized individuals who knew, on a purely instinctive level, where every organ was and how to keep a wounded warrior fighting. Even the Krork language was genetic, meaning that a newly spawned Krork could communicate with its fellows from the moment it emerged. And here is where the genius of the Old One's design really becomes apparent. The Krork did not reproduce the way most species do. They were part fungus, a symbiotic fusion of animal and algal cellular structures that the Old Ones had woven together with breathtaking precision. When a Krork died, its body released millions of spores into the surrounding environment. These spores would settle into the soil, begin to grow, and eventually produce new Krork, not just warriors either, as the spores contained the genetic information for the entire Orkoid ecosystem, from the smallest squigs and snotlings up through the Gretchen servant caste, and finally to the full-grown warriors themselves. Think about what this means. The Old Ones had created a species that was, for all practical purposes, self-replicating, self-sustaining, and self-equipping. You did not need to transport Krork to a battlefield. You just needed to get a few of them onto a planet, and within a relatively short time, an entire army would grow from the ground up, complete with soldiers, support personnel, and the instinctive knowledge to build whatever weapons and equipment they needed from locally available materials. It was the ultimate expeditionary force, designed for a galaxy-spanning war where supply lines might stretch across thousands of light years and reinforcements might take centuries to arrive. Against the Necrons, the Krork were devastating. They could absorb casualties that would have broken any other army and regenerate their numbers within months or years rather than decades. They could fight on worlds that had been so thoroughly devastated by the Necrons' reality-warping weapons that no other species could survive there. And they actually enjoyed the fighting, which meant that morale was never an issue. You did not need to convince a Krork to charge into the teeth of a Necron phalanx. It wanted to be there. It lived for this. The war in heaven lasted for eons. It shattered the galactic civilization that the Old Ones had built over millions of years. It fractured the barriers between the physical universe and the warp so badly that the psychic dimension began bleeding through into reality, spawning the first demons and laying the groundwork for the Chaos Gods who would later emerge. It killed the Old Ones themselves, whether through direct combat with the Necrons and Citan, or through the new horrors that their own desperation had unleashed. The Enslavers, terrible warp entities that could possess psychers and use them as portals to drag more of their kind into the physical universe, are sometimes cited as the final blow that finished off what the Necrons had started. But the Krork survived. Of course they survived. They had been designed to survive anything. In the aftermath of the war in heaven, with the Old Ones gone and the Necrons entering their great sleep, as the Krork were left without purpose, without guidance, and without the organizing intelligence that had directed them during the conflict, over the next 60 million years, something happened. Something changed. The Krork, those towering, sophisticated warriors in their advanced power armor, gradually became something else. They became smaller. Their technology degraded. Their social structures simplified. The intricate knowledge encoded in their DNA began to express itself in cruder, less refined ways. They became, in a word, the Orks. Now, the question of how and why this devolution occurred is one of the great mysteries of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Some scholars believe it was simply the natural result of 60 million years of existence without the Old One's guiding hand, a kind of genetic drift on a cosmic scale. And others theorize that the Krork were always designed to scale with their enemies, growing larger, smarter, and more technologically sophisticated as the threats they faced increased. and that the relatively quiet millennia after the war in heaven simply did not provide sufficient stimulation to maintain their peak capabilities. This second theory is particularly terrifying because it implies something deeply unsettling about the Orks. It implies that what we see today, the disorganized green hordes with their junkyard technology and their endless infighting, is not the Orks at full power. It is the Orks in standby mode. It is the Orks at the absolute minimum level of capability needed to survive and propagate in a galaxy that, compared to the war in heaven, is relatively peaceful. And if the galaxy were to become sufficiently dangerous, yes, if the Orks were pushed hard enough and gathered in sufficient numbers, the encoded potential of the Krork could begin to reassert itself. We have seen glimpses of this. During the War of the Beast, in the 32nd Millennium, which we will explore in great detail later, the Orks developed technology and social complexity that stunned the Imperium. They built gravity weapons. They constructed attack moons. They fielded diplomats. Orks that could speak in complete sentences, negotiate, and make reasoned arguments. The Imperium barely survived that encounter, and it fundamentally changed several of its most important institutions as a direct result. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what the Orks have done, we need to understand what they are. And to do that, we need to look more closely at the most remarkable aspect of their existence, their biology. Because the Orks are not just soldiers, they are not just warriors, they are an entire ecosystem compressed into a single species, a self-contained biological system designed to conquer, colonize, and persist on any world in the galaxy. From frozen ice wastes to caustic acid swamps, from irradiated death worlds to the shattered remains of planets that have undergone exterminatus. And it all starts with something so small you cannot see it without magnification. It starts with a spore. To understand why the Orks represent such a fundamental and persistent threat to every other species in the galaxy, you need to understand something that most people overlook when they think about these green-skinned brutes. You need to understand their biology. And when I say biology, I do not mean the obvious stuff, the thick slabs of muscle, the heavy bone structure, the green skin, and the jutting jaws full of teeth. All of that is impressive in its own right, certainly, and we will talk about it. But the real horror of Ork biology is not visible on the surface. The real horror is hidden at the cellular level, encoded in a genetic structure so sophisticated that the brightest minds of the Adeptus Mechanicus have spent centuries trying to fully understand it and have barely scratched the surface. Orks are not simply animals. They are not even simply aliens. They are a symbiotic fusion of two entirely different types of organism. One is comparable to a terrestrial animal, providing the structure, the musculature, the nervous system, and the conscious awareness that we associate with a living creature. The other is comparable to an algae or a fungus, living within the animal component's bloodstream and skin tissue, and providing a whole suite of capabilities that no purely animal organism could ever possess. The fungal component of Ork physiology is responsible for several critical functions. First, it contributes to the Ork's remarkable regenerative capacity. When an Ork is wounded, the fungal cells in its bloodstream kick into overdrive, providing additional biochemical energy through a form of biosynthesis that accelerates healing to a degree that would be considered miraculous in any other species. An Ork can survive wounds that would kill a space marine. Severed limbs, catastrophic organ damage, even significant brain trauma can be endured and, in many cases, are recovered from. There are documented cases of Orks having their heads completely severed and then reattached by the crude surgeons known as pain boys, with the patient making a full recovery and being back in the fight within days. But even more important than their regenerative abilities is the Ork reproductive cycle, because this is where the true genius of the Old One's design becomes undeniable. Throughout its entire life, from the moment it emerges from the ground to the moment it dies, an Ork continuously releases microscopic spores from its body. These spores are shed from the skin, expelled through breathing, and released in massive quantities upon death. Each spore carries the complete genetic blueprint for the entire orkoid ecosystem, not just for orcs, but for every subspecies and variant in the greenskin family tree. Or when these spores settle into soil or any similarly nourishing medium, they begin to grow. They develop into complex plant-like structures underground, forming a kind of subterranean garden that slowly produces more and more complex forms of life. The first things to emerge are squigs, small, biting creatures that feed on the fungal growths and help to spread the spores further. Then come snotlings, tiny and relatively harmless orkoid creatures that tend to the underground gardens and begin building rudimentary settlements. After that, Gretchen appear, the cunning, cowardly servant caste that provides labor and cannon fodder for orc society. And finally, the orcs themselves emerge, full-grown, combat-ready, and instinctively knowing how to fight, how to speak, and how to build basic weapons. Do you understand what this means? Let me spell it out because I think the implications are so profound that they are easy to miss. You cannot eradicate the orcs from a planet once they have been there. Not really, not completely. Every orc that has ever walked across a world's surface has been shedding spores the entire time. Every orc that has died on that world has released a massive burst of reproductive material into the environment. Those spores settle into cracks in rocks, drift into cave systems, burrow into soil, and there they wait. They can survive for years, decades, possibly centuries, and when conditions are right, they begin to grow. This is why the Imperium resorts to exterminatus, the complete destruction of a planet's biosphere, when dealing with particularly severe orc infestations. As it is not because the Imperial Guard cannot win the battle on the ground. It is because even if they kill every single orc on the surface, even if they burn every settlement and destroy every vehicle and eliminate every last Gretchen hiding in the rubble, the spores are still there, underground, waiting. Within a few years, the first squigs will emerge. Within a generation, there will be a new population of orcs, spawned from the very world they were supposedly driven from, with no memory of the previous conflict and no care about it either. They will simply start the cycle all over again. This biological reality transforms the orc threat from a military problem into an ecological catastrophe. You are not fighting an army. You are fighting a biome. As you are trying to eradicate a species that was specifically engineered to be impossible to eradicate by beings who were considerably smarter than you and had millions of years of experience in biological warfare. Good luck. And the orc body itself is a testament to the Old One's genius as combat engineers. An average orc boy stands between 6 and 7 feet tall, though the largest can reach well over 8 feet. They are enormously strong, with musculature that is denser and more powerful than that of a human being of comparable size. Their bones are thick and heavy, providing both structure and natural armor against impacts. Their skin is green, obviously, pigmented by the algal cells that live within it, and it is remarkably tough, providing a degree of natural protection against cuts, abrasions, and even low-caliber projectile weapons. Orcs feel pain, but they do not experience it the way humans do. Their nervous system is wired to interpret pain as something closer to an annoyance than a debilitating sensation, which means that an orc in the throes of combat can absorb tremendous punishment without slowing down. There are countless reports from Imperial Guardsmen of shooting orcs multiple times with standard-issue lasguns and watching in horror as the massive greenskins simply shrugged off the wounds and kept coming, still bellowing, still swinging their crude blades, still very much in the fight. Their cardiovascular system is similarly robust. While humans have one heart and space marines have two, the orc circulatory system is less centralized and more distributed, meaning that even catastrophic damage to one area of the body does not necessarily shut down blood flow to the rest. Combined with their fungal-boosted regeneration, this makes them extraordinarily hard to kill through anything short of massive, instantaneous trauma. Decapitation works. Total incineration works. Pretty much everything else is a gamble. And then there is the question of how orcs grow. Because orcs are not born at a fixed size and stay that way. They grow throughout their lives, and their growth is directly linked to how much fighting they do. An orc that fights frequently and wins consistently will grow larger, stronger, and tougher over time, developing more muscle mass, thicker skin, and a more prominent jaw. This is not metaphorical. This is not a gradual aging process like what humans experience. This is a measurable or observable phenomenon that has been documented by the Adeptus Mechanicus across hundreds of case studies. The more successful an orc is in combat, the bigger it gets. This creates a natural hierarchy that is elegant in its simplicity. The biggest orc is the boss. It is the boss because it is the biggest, and it is the biggest because it has been the most successful fighter. Any orc that wants to challenge the boss has to literally beat it in a fight, which is extremely difficult because the boss is, by definition, the biggest and toughest orc around. It is a self-reinforcing system of leadership that requires no elections, no bureaucracy, no political maneuvering, just fists and teeth and the willingness to use them. The largest orcs, the ones who have fought and won for decades or even centuries, can become truly enormous. A fully grown war boss can stand 10 feet tall or more, a walking slab of green muscle and scrap metal armor that can crush a man's skull in one hand and bench press a chimera transport vehicle with the other. And even the war bosses are dwarfed by the truly ancient orc warlords, the ones who have been fighting for so long and so successfully that they have grown to a size that approaches the legendary Krork of old. Gazgakul Thraka, the most notorious orc war boss in the current era, is estimated to stand well over 12 feet tall, and he shows no signs of stopping. All of this, the regeneration, the spore reproduction, the combat-linked growth, the incredible resilience, makes the orcs a species that is almost perfectly adapted for one thing and one thing only: war. They were designed for it 60 million years ago, and 60 million years of evolution has only refined the design. Every aspect of their biology, from the cellular level up to the organizational level, is optimized for combat, for survival in hostile environments, and for the relentless propagation of their kind. But there is one more aspect of orc biology that we need to discuss, one that is arguably the most important and the most terrifying of all. It is the one that makes everything else work, the one that bridges the gap between crude scrap metal technology and devastating battlefield effectiveness, the one that allows a species of apparent savages to build starships and travel between the stars and wage war on a galactic scale despite having no formal education, no research institutions, and no understanding of the scientific method. It is the Gestalt psychic field, and it changes everything. If you were to take an orc weapon, one of those crude, heavy, ugly firearms they call shooters, and hand it to a Mechanicus tech priest for analysis, the tech priest would probably have a seizure. Not a metaphorical seizure, an actual, physical breakdown of composure that would leave them sputtering binary cant and clutching their mechadendrites in horror. Because by any rational analysis, by any application of known engineering principles, by any standard of metallurgy or ballistics or energy transfer, the weapon should not work. It is, in most cases, little more than a tube of scrap metal with a crude firing mechanism bolted to one end and a handle welded to the other. The barrel is rarely straight. The ammunition is often the wrong caliber. Yet the moving parts do not fit together with anything approaching precision. If you gave this same weapon to a human soldier and told them to fire it, there is a very real chance that it would jam, explode, or simply do nothing at all. But give it to an orc, and it fires. Give it to an orc surrounded by other orcs, and it fires reliably. Give it to an orc in the middle of a massive battle with thousands of greenskins all around, all fighting and bellowing and generally having the time of their lives, and that crude, impossible weapon suddenly performs like a finely machined instrument of death, spitting out rounds with a consistency and lethality that the weapon's construction simply cannot explain. This is the Gestalt psychic field in action. This is the phenomenon that the Imperium's scholars have been trying to understand for for 10,000 years and have only begun to scratch the surface of. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful and terrifying forces in the entire galaxy. Here is how it works, or at least, here is what we think we understand about how it works. All orcs generate a low-level psychic field. Individually, this field is negligible, barely detectable even by the most sensitive psykers. But orcs are never alone. Orcs exist in groups, in mobs, in hordes, in armies that can number in the millions or even billions. And when you start adding those individual psychic fields together, something remarkable happens. The collective field becomes exponentially more powerful than the sum of its parts. It becomes a force that can actually bend reality. The most obvious and well-documented manifestation of this field is its effect on orc technology. Mechboys, the orc caste that is genetically predisposed to building and maintaining machinery, do genuinely possess instinctive engineering knowledge that was hardwired into their DNA by the old ones. They understand mechanical principles at an intuitive level, and the things they build are, at their core, based on sound engineering concepts. A shooter is, fundamentally, a projectile weapon that uses a chemical propellant to accelerate a metal slug through a barrel. The concept is correct. The execution is where things get questionable. And this is where the Gestalt field steps in. It fills the gaps. It smooths over the imperfections. And it takes a weapon that is 80% of the way to functional and provides the psychic equivalent of duct tape and good intentions to bridge that remaining 20%. The barrel that is slightly too wide. The bullet still goes straight because the orc firing it believes that it should go straight, and the Gestalt field makes that belief into a localized reality. The engine that should not turn over because the fuel lines are connected incorrectly. It roars to life because the mech boy who built it knows in his bones that it should work, and the field validates that knowledge. This is not unlimited, and it is important to understand the boundaries of this phenomenon if you want to understand why the orcs are dangerous rather than omnipotent. The Gestalt field does not create something from nothing. An orc cannot pick up an empty pipe and use it as a weapon, despite what some older accounts have suggested. There has to be a foundation, a genuine mechanical or physical basis for the field to enhance. Think of it like this. If conventional technology is a bridge built from steel and concrete, then orc technology is a bridge built from scrap metal and optimism, with the Gestalt field serving as invisible structural supports that keep the whole thing from collapsing. Remove the orc, remove the field, and the bridge falls down, which is exactly what happens when other species try to use captured orc equipment. Without the Gestalt field to hold everything together, the technology often fails catastrophically. But there is another, even more fascinating aspect of the Gestalt field. And this is the one that has driven Mechanicus tech priests to quietly drink recaf in the dark at 3 a.m. while staring at their data slates with haunted eyes. The field does not just make things work, it makes them work better based on what the orcs believe about them. The most famous example of this is the orc belief about colors. Orcs believe, with total and unshakable conviction, that certain colors have specific effects. Red makes things go faster. Blue brings good luck. Yellow makes bigger explosions. Purple is sneaky because, as the orcs reason with impeccable logic, nobody has ever seen a purple orc. And the terrifying thing is that this actually works. Orc vehicles painted red have been measured by Imperial observers as traveling measurably faster than identical vehicles that are not painted red. Not dramatically faster, not breaking the laws of physics faster, but enough to be statistically significant. Orc weapons loaded with yellow-painted ammunition do seem to produce slightly larger detonations. These are not anecdotes or rumors. These are documented observations made by trained Imperial personnel under controlled conditions. The implications of this are staggering. The orcs possess a collective psychic ability that can alter the physical properties of material objects based on nothing more than sincere belief, and they do not even know they are doing it. That is perhaps the most crucial detail of all. The Orks do not understand that they possess this power. They do not know that their beliefs are reshaping reality around them. They think that red things go faster because that is simply how the universe works. Yeah, the same way that gravity pulls things down and fire is hot. It is not a power they can consciously control or deliberately weaponize, which is probably the only thing preventing them from being utterly unstoppable. Because here is the paradox. If the Orks ever figured out what they were doing, if they ever truly understood the nature of their gestalt field and tried to deliberately use it, it would stop working. The field is powered by belief, not knowledge. The moment an Ork understands that red things go faster because he believes they do, rather than because that is an inherent property of red things, the belief becomes self-aware and loses its power. The Orks' ignorance of their own abilities is both their greatest limitation and their greatest strength. They cannot weaponize what they do not understand. Oh, but they also cannot doubt what they do not question. Now, extend this principle outward. Consider what happens when the number of Orks in one place reaches truly massive proportions. The Gestalt field does not just enhance technology, it influences the Orks themselves. When millions of Orks gather for a massive military campaign, the collective psychic energy becomes so intense that it manifests as a tangible force, a wave of aggressive, euphoric, reality-warping power that the Orks simply call their great war cry, their battle howl, their call to arms. This psychic phenomenon affects everything within its radius. Ork weapons become more reliable. Ork vehicles become faster and tougher. Ork warriors become stronger, more aggressive, and harder to kill. The very air seems to crackle with green energy. And the ground trembles not just from the physical footsteps of millions of marching greenskins, but from the sheer psychic weight of their collective will to wage war. And there is a specialist caste of Orks, the Weird Boys, who can tap into this energy directly. Unlike most Orks, Weird Boys are individually psychic, able to channel the Gestalt field into focused bursts of destructive power. A Weird Boy, in the middle of a large Ork army, is essentially a living lightning rod for the collective aggression of every greenskin around him, and the effects can be spectacular. Bolts of green psychic energy that can melt through tank armor, psychic shockwaves that can crush infantry formations, even teleportation, flinging handfuls of Orks through the warp and depositing them behind enemy lines, which is simultaneously one of the most useful and most dangerous tactical abilities in the Ork arsenal, since the Orks in question do not always arrive in one piece. The downside for Weird Boys is that they cannot turn this ability off. When the psychic energy around them builds to a critical level, it has to go somewhere, and if the Weird Boy does not release it deliberately, it builds up inside his skull until his head literally explodes in a shower of green energy and bone fragments, which, admittedly, the other Orks find quite entertaining. This is why Weird Boys are simultaneously revered and avoided by their fellow greenskins, dragged to the front lines when their power is needed, and kept at arm's length the rest of the time. Put it all together, the biological resilience, the spore-based reproduction, the combat-linked growth, at the Gestalt psychic field, and you begin to see the true scope of the Ork threat. This is not a species that can be defeated in the traditional sense. You can win battles against them, you can drive them from worlds, you can kill millions, even billions of them, but you cannot make them stop. You cannot make them go away. They will always come back because their bodies are literally designed to ensure that they always come back. Every battle you fight against them, win or lose, leaves behind the spores that will produce the next generation. Every Ork you kill today is planting the seeds for the Ork that will try to kill you tomorrow. And the more you fight them, the stronger they become. The more pressure you apply, the bigger their leaders grow, the more intense their Gestalt field becomes. And the more sophisticated their technology gets. It is a feedback loop that the Orks themselves would not understand if you explained it to them, and they do not need to understand it, because it happens automatically, below the level of conscious thought, driven by 60 million years of genetic programming that was put there by beings who were much, much smarter than any of us. The Orks are a weapon that was built to outlast its creators, and after 60 million years, it is still working exactly as intended. Now let us talk about how all of this translates into the way Orks actually organize themselves, because their society is just as remarkable as their biology, and just as perfectly adapted for perpetual warfare. Let us talk about the clans, the culture, and the brutal, the elegant hierarchy of violence that holds the entire greenskin civilization together. Ork society looks, on the surface, like complete chaos. And in many ways, it is. There is no central government, no written law, no diplomatic corps, no bureaucracy, no taxation system, no formal judiciary, and absolutely no concept of civil rights. There are no schools, no universities, no libraries, and no research institutions. There is no art in the way that humans understand it, no music that does not involve the sounds of gunfire and explosions, no literature beyond crude glyphs scratched into metal plates, and no philosophy more sophisticated than the principle that bigger is better, and hitting things is the correct solution to most problems. And yet, despite all of this, Ork civilization works. Well, it works well enough to sustain the most numerous intelligent species in the galaxy. It works well enough to support a spacefaring civilization that spans millions of worlds. It works well enough to produce armies that have threatened the Imperium of man on multiple occasions and come within a hair's breadth of destroying it entirely. The question of how this is possible is one of the most fascinating puzzles in the entire setting, and the answer lies in the same place as everything else about the Orks, in their genes. Ork society is organized around a single, brutally simple principle. The biggest Ork is in charge. Period. Full stop. No exceptions, no qualifications, no electoral college. If you are the biggest, strongest, most physically imposing Ork in a given group, you are the boss of that group. If someone bigger shows up, they are the new boss, and you either submit or get beaten until you do.
And honestly, this is the part that gets me every time I dig into the Orks. Like, I spent weeks going through all of this for you guys, and the thing that sticks with me isn't the big battles or the crazy technology, it's the spores. That one detail just lives in my head rent-free. You can win every single fight, kill every last Ork on the planet, throw a parade, hang up the banners, and it doesn't matter. They're already in the dirt. They're already growing back. That's not a war you can win, that's a condition you learn to live with. And I think that's what makes the Ork my personal pick for the scariest faction in the entire setting. Not because they're the strongest in any one moment, but because they're the only ones who literally cannot lose in the long run. Every other faction has a clock running out somewhere. The Orks don't have a clock, they are the clock. But anyways, let's continue the video.
If you want to be boss, and you are not currently the biggest, you have two options. Grow bigger by fighting more, or challenge the current boss and take the position by force. These are the only two paths to advancement in Ork society, and they have served the species well for 60 million years. This principle operates at every level of the Ork hierarchy. At the smallest scale, you have individual mobs, groups of roughly 20 to 30 Orks, who follow the biggest boy in their immediate vicinity. These mobs are led by nobs, which is the Ork term for any Ork that is noticeably bigger and tougher than a standard boy. Nobs earn their position through constant fighting, both against enemies and against other Orks who want to challenge them for status. For multiple mobs form a warband, which is led by a war boss, an Ork who has grown large enough and fought successfully enough to command the loyalty, or at least the grudging obedience, of several hundred to several thousand greenskins. War bosses are genuinely formidable beings, standing a good head or more above even the biggest nobs and armed with the best weapons and armor that their personal mechboy can provide. Multiple warbands form a tribe, which is led by the biggest war boss in the region, sometimes called a warlord. A warlord commands tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Orks, and his authority extends across an entire planet or even a small cluster of worlds. At this level, The hierarchy starts to take on some of the complexity of a real military organization, with various knobs serving as lieutenants, as specialist units being deployed for specific tasks, and something that almost resembles strategic planning beginning to emerge. And at the very top of the pile, appearing only rarely, but with devastating consequences when they do, are the true Orc warlords, beings of such immense size and power and charisma that they can unite dozens of tribes under a single banner and launch the kind of massive, galaxy-spanning military campaigns that the Imperium refers to with a mixture of dread and exhaustion. These are the Orcs who trigger what is known as a Great Green Crusade, a gathering of the clans that can involve millions or even billions of greenskins, all moving in roughly the same direction with roughly the same objective, which is usually to find the biggest fight available and win it. Now, within this broad hierarchy, yet there is another layer of organization that adds both color and functionality to Orc society. These are the clans, the great cultural groupings that define an Orc's preferences, fighting style, and general approach to the business of making war. There are 6 major clans that are found throughout the galaxy, present in virtually every Orc tribe, regardless of where in the galaxy that tribe is located. Each clan has its own traditions, its own preferred combat style, its own color scheme, and its own attitude toward the rest of Orc society. An Orc's clan affiliation is not chosen. It is determined by genetics, by the same hardwired instincts that determine whether an Orc will become a mech boy, or a pain boy, or a standard warrior. An Orc simply knows, on a fundamental level, which clan it belongs to, and it gravitates toward other Orcs of the same clan, the way water flows downhill. The Goths are the biggest, meanest, and most straightforwardly aggressive of all the clans. They love close combat above all things, and view ranged warfare with something approaching contempt. A true Goth wants to feel the crunch of bone beneath his fist, and hear the screams of his enemies up close and personal, not shoot at them from behind a rock like some kind of coward. Goths favor black as their primary color, with a distinctive check pattern of black and white that decorates their armor and banners. They are the most common clan to produce war bosses, because their emphasis on raw physical aggression tends to produce the biggest, toughest Orcs. Gazkul Thraka himself is a Goth, which should tell you something about the caliber of leaders this clan produces. The evil sons are the speed addicts of the Orc world. They are irresistibly drawn to fast vehicles, loud engines, and the sheer exhilarating rush of charging into battle at breakneck speed. Where a Goth wants to walk up to the enemy and punch them, an evil son wants to drive a ramshackle buggy straight through the enemy's lines at 200 miles per hour, while firing wildly in all directions. They paint everything red, because everyone knows that red goes faster, and they have the largest population of mech boys of any clan, because all those vehicles need constant maintenance. Evil Sun settlements are characterized by the constant roar of engines being tuned and tested, unpunctuated by the occasional explosion when a fuel tank ruptures or a supercharged engine block decides to express its displeasure. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest clan, and they flaunt it with a shamelessness that would make an imperial noble blush. The source of their wealth is biological. Bad Moon Orcs grow their teeth faster than any other clan, and since teeth are the standard unit of Orc currency, this means that even the lowliest Bad Moon boy has more spending money than most other Orcs can dream of. They use this wealth to acquire the best weapons, the flashiest armor, and the most ostentatious personal gear available, favoring gaudy yellow and black color schemes that ensure everyone knows exactly how rich they are. Their signature unit is the Flash Gits, a heavily armed Orcs with custom-built firearms so oversized and so covered in gold trim and shiny bits that they would be comical if they were not so devastatingly effective. The Death Skulls are the looters, the scavengers, the ones who descend on a battlefield the moment the fighting stops and strip it of every usable piece of equipment, material, and technology they can find. Other clans view them with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect, because while nobody likes having their stuff stolen, everyone has to admit that the Death Skulls are remarkably good at it. They paint themselves and their equipment blue, because blue is the luckiest color according to Ork belief. And their ranks contain some of the most skilled mech boys in the galaxy, partly because they have access to a constant stream of salvaged parts and captured technology to work with. A Death Skull mech boy, who has been given free rein to combine bits of Eldar Wraithbone with Tau Pulse technology and Imperial plasma coils, is a terrifying thing indeed. The Blood Axes are the closest thing the Ork race has to military professionals, and for this, they are despised by virtually every other clan. The Blood Axes were the first Ork clan to have extensive contact with the Imperium of Man, and from that contact, they picked up certain human habits that other Orks find deeply offensive. Things like wearing camouflage, using battlefield tactics, planning ahead, retreating when a battle is going badly instead of fighting to the death. To a Goth or an evil son, this kind of behavior is practically heretical, as a betrayal of everything it means to be a proper Ork. But the Blood Axes do not care what other Orks think of them, because their methods work. And in a galaxy this dangerous, working is what matters. And finally, the Snakebites are the traditionalists, the Orks who reject modern technology in favor of the old ways. While other clans ride to battle in vehicles and wield increasingly sophisticated weapons, the Snakebites prefer to ride great beasts into combat, fight with clubs and axes, and live a lifestyle that the other clans consider primitively backwards, but that the Snakebites themselves view as the purest expression of what it means to be an Ork. They have a higher proportion of weird boys than any other clan, and their close relationship with the various beasts of the Orkoid ecosystem, and particularly the increasingly popular Squighogs, gives them a unique tactical niche that more technologically advanced clans cannot easily replicate. Beyond the clans, there are the Odd Boys, those specialized Orks whose genetically encoded knowledge sets them apart from the rank and file. We have already discussed the Mech Boys and their instinctive understanding of technology, but there are others who are equally important to the functioning of Ork society. Pain Boys, also known as Mad Docs, are the medical specialists of the Ork world, and I use the word medical in the loosest possible sense. A Pain Boy possesses an instinctive understanding of Ork anatomy and basic surgical principles, which sounds reassuring until you realize that their idea of surgery involves hammering metal plates onto broken bones, by reattaching severed limbs with bolts and industrial adhesive, and occasionally swapping out a patient's arm for a completely different arm that belonged to someone else, sometimes without being asked. Ork patients typically only visit a Pain Boy when they are so badly injured that the alternative is death, and even then, many Orks would prefer to take their chances with natural regeneration, rather than submit to the tender mercies of a Mad Doc's operating table. Runthards are the slavers and beast handlers of Ork society, responsible for managing the vast populations of Gretchen and Snotlings that perform most of the manual labor in Ork settlements. Armed with grabber sticks and squig hounds, Runthards keep the smaller Orkoid subspecies in line through a combination of physical intimidation and the occasional motivational beating. Without Runthards, Ork settlements would quickly descend into even more chaos than usual, as the Gretchen workforce that maintains the basic infrastructure of Ork life would scatter and hide at the first opportunity. And then there are the Weird Boys, whom we discussed earlier in the context of the Gestalt field. These psychically sensitive Orks serve as living conduits for the collective psychic energy of the Horde, channeling it into devastating psychic attacks on the battlefield. They are simultaneously valued and feared by their fellow Orks, dragged to the front lines when their power is needed, and kept under close watch at all other times, lest the pressure of accumulated psychic energy cause their heads to detonate without warning. Ork religion, such as it is, centers around two gods, Gork and Mork. Gork is the god of brutal cunning, which means he hits you hard when you are looking right at him. Mork is the god of cunning brutality, which means he hits you hard when you are not looking. The theological distinction between these two concepts has been the subject of more Ork-on-Ork violence than probably any other disagreement in greenskin history, which is saying something for a species that views disagreement and violence as essentially synonymous. Gork and Mork are not abstract concepts to the Orks. They are living presences, believed to be constantly watching the galaxy and cheering on particularly impressive acts of violence. The construction of towering war machines called gargants is seen as an act of devotion to these gods, as the gargants are built in the rough likeness of Gork and Mork, enormous bipedal engines of destruction that stride across the battlefield, spreading devastation in their wake. The bigger the gargant, the more pleased the gods are believed to be, which is as good a motivation as any for building something the size of a skyscraper out of scrap metal and fury. The currency of Ork society is teeth, actual teeth. The bigger and more intact the tooth, the more it is worth. This system is simultaneously primitive and ingenious because teeth have several properties that make them ideal as a medium of exchange in a culture where everyone is trying to hit everyone else in the face. They are durable. They are difficult to counterfeit, since an orc can tell a real tooth from a fake one instinctively. They have a natural rate of depreciation since teeth eventually degrade over time, which prevents the accumulation of massive wealth and ensures a relatively constant circulation of currency. And they are, in a very literal sense, always available, since any orc with a good right hook and a weaker orc nearby can make a withdrawal at any time. This is Ork society. It is loud, violent, chaotic, and seemingly dysfunctional, but it has endured for 60 million years, which is longer than any other civilization in the galaxy. It has spread to every corner of the Milky Way and possibly beyond, since some Imperial listening posts have reportedly detected Ork signals originating from other galaxies entirely. And it is, despite all appearances, remarkably efficient at doing the one thing it was designed to do, which is making war. But because here is the thing that people miss when they look at Ork society and see only chaos and stupidity. Every aspect of this civilization, from the hierarchy based on physical size to the clan structure, to the odd boys, to the gestalt field, is designed to scale. When times are peaceful and the Orks are just fighting among themselves on some backwater world, the system operates at its minimum level, producing small tribes and petty warbands that are a nuisance but not a strategic threat. But when a sufficiently powerful leader emerges, when the fighting gets serious enough to trigger the growth hormones and the gestalt field starts ramping up, the entire system shifts into a higher gear. More Orks means more psychic energy. More psychic energy means better technology and bigger leaders. Bigger leaders mean more Orks following them, which means more psychic energy, which means even better technology and even bigger leaders. It is a positive feedback loop that can, under the right circumstances, escalate from a minor skirmish to a galaxy-threatening invasion in a matter of years. The Imperium has seen this happen multiple times, and every time, it has nearly destroyed them. Let us talk about the most devastating of those times. Let us talk about the War of the Beast. But before we continue to that critical chapter of history, there is something more we need to understand about how the Orkoid ecosystem actually functions on a colonized world, because this detail is what transforms the Orks from a dangerous enemy into an almost insurmountable ecological catastrophe. And it is something that most accounts of the Ork race skim over too quickly. When Ork spores settle on a new world, they do not immediately produce full-grown warriors. The process is gradual, layered, and disturbingly systematic, unfolding over weeks and months in a progression that mirrors the development of a complete ecosystem, rather than the birth of individual organisms. The first stage is the fungal bloom. Beneath the surface of the soil, the spores begin to grow into a network of fungal structures that serve as both nutrient processing systems and incubation chambers. These underground growths are fed by whatever organic material is available in the surrounding soil, and they are remarkably resilient, capable of thriving in conditions that would kill most terrestrial plants. Toxic environments, irradiated landscapes, frozen wastelands, none of these pose a significant obstacle to the Orkoid fungal network. It adapts, it persists, it grows. From these fungal networks emerge the first visible signs of orkoid life, squigs. These small, often spherical creatures come in an astonishing variety of forms, each adapted for a specific ecological role. There are edible squigs that serve as the primary food source for the orkoid ecosystem. There are attack squigs with powerful jaws that serve as guard animals and war beasts. There are hair squigs that orcs attach to their heads for cosmetic purposes. There are parasite hunting squigs that clean wounds and consume infection. There are even musical squigs that produce sounds when squeezed, though the resulting noise can only generously be described as music by the standards of a species that considers the sound of gunfire to be aesthetically pleasing. The squigs feed on the fungal growths and on each other, and their activity helps to spread the spores further, both through their movement across the landscape and through their biological processes. They are, in effect, the pollinators and seed carriers of the orkoid ecosystem, ensuring that the fungal network extends well beyond the initial point of contamination. Next come the snotlings, the smallest and weakest of the orkoid subspecies. Snotlings are tiny, barely intelligent creatures that live in large swarms and tend to the underground fungal gardens with a kind of dim, instinctive devotion. They cultivate the fungus, harvest squigs for food, and begin constructing rudimentary underground shelters that will eventually serve as the foundations for orc settlements. Left to their own devices, which a snotling colony can sustain itself indefinitely, creating a self-contained mini ecosystem that quietly produces the conditions for the next stage of development. Then the Gretchen arrive, larger and considerably more cunning than snotlings, though still far smaller and weaker than full-grown orcs. Gretchen, also known as grots, possess a low animal intelligence that is slightly better developed than the snotlings, and that allows them to perform more complex tasks. They build structures, operate basic machinery, and can even be trained to use simple weapons, though their natural cowardice makes them poor fighters compared to their larger cousins. In orc society, Gretchen serve as laborers, servants, ammunition carriers, living shields, and general-purpose victims of whatever casual violence the orcs feel like inflicting at any given moment. Despite their lowly status, Gretchen are surprisingly resourceful and cunning within their limited sphere, and they can be genuinely dangerous in large numbers, particularly during naval boarding actions where knots of Gretchen squirm through air ducts, sabotage vital machinery, and overwhelm wounded defenders in triage stations. And finally, after all of these preceding stages have established a functioning ecosystem with food production, shelter, and basic infrastructure, the orcs themselves emerge. Full-grown, combat-ready, and born with the instinctive knowledge they need to build weapons, speak the orc language, and immediately begin doing what orcs do best, which is fighting whatever happens to be nearby. This entire process, from initial spore deposition to the emergence of the first orcs, can take as little as a few years under favorable conditions. And it happens beneath the notice of most planetary authorities, because the early stages produce no detectable energy signatures, no technological emissions, and nothing that would trigger the orbital sensor networks that the Imperium relies on to detect Xenos incursions. By the time the first orcs emerge from underground and start making their presence known, the infestation is already deeply established, with a robust fungal network and supporting ecosystem that makes complete eradication extraordinarily difficult. This is why Imperial commanders who have experience fighting orcs learn, often the hard way, that the battle does not end when the last orc is killed. The real challenge begins after the shooting stops, when specialized decontamination teams must be deployed to scour the terrain for lingering spores, fungal growths, and hidden snotling warrens. These cleanup operations can take years and are never completely successful. There are documented cases of worlds that were declared clean of orkoid contamination, only to experience a new orc emergence decades, or even centuries later, spawned from spores that survived deep underground in conditions that the decontamination teams could not reach. This is the biological horror of the Orks, stated plainly. They do not invade a world, they infect it. And once infected, a world can never truly be cured. It can only be managed, contained, monitored, and, if all else fails, destroyed. This is the calculus that Imperial strategists must weigh every time they commit forces to fight Orks on a planet's surface. Every battle fought on the ground deposits more spores. Every Ork killed releases a final massive burst of reproductive material. The act of fighting the Orks on a world virtually guarantees that the world will produce more Orks in the future. It is a trap built into the very biology of the species, and it is a trap that was set 60 million years ago by minds far more sophisticated than anything the modern galaxy can produce. The Old Ones designed the Orks to be the ultimate persistent threat, a species that not only could not be eradicated, but that actually benefited from attempts to eradicate it. Every effort to destroy them makes them harder to destroy. Every battle feeds the cycle. Every dead Ork plants the seeds for the next generation. This is not a flaw in the design. This is the design. Let us also pause to consider a dimension of Ork warfare that is often overlooked in discussions that focus primarily on ground combat. The Orks are not merely a land-based threat. They are a spacefaring civilization, and their capabilities in the void between worlds, while crude by Imperial standards, are no less dangerous for their crudeness. Ork space travel relies on two primary methods, and both are characteristically Orkish in their approach to the problems of faster-than-light travel. The first is the use of space hulks, those enormous conglomerations of wrecked, fused, and abandoned ships that drift through the warp like metallic tumbleweeds. In space hulks form when multiple vessels become trapped together in the Imperium, their hulls fusing and merging over centuries until they become a single, enormous mass of twisted metal and forgotten technology. These hulks drift in and out of real space on unpredictable trajectories, sometimes appearing in orbit around inhabited worlds without any warning at all. Orks are drawn to space hulks the way moths are drawn to flames, and for similar reasons. A space hulk represents an irresistible combination of things that Orks love: salvageable technology, potential enemies lurking in the dark corridors, and a means of transportation to new and exciting fights elsewhere in the galaxy. When an Ork tribe captures a space hulk, they do not attempt to navigate it in any conventional sense. They board it, fight whatever is already living inside it, which can range from feral human colonists to Jenny Stealer cults to actual demons, and then ride it wherever the currents of the warp happen to take them. If they end up somewhere with a good fight waiting, excellent. If not, they can always fight each other until the hulk drifts somewhere more promising. The second method of Ork space travel is more conventional, in the loosest possible sense of the word. Mechboys can and do build Ork warships from scratch, using the same combination of scavenged materials, instinctive engineering knowledge, and Gestalt field enhancement that they apply to everything else. An Ork warship looks, from the outside, like a scrapyard that has been given engines and told to fly. It is covered in bolted-on armor plates, jutting weapon batteries, crude sensor arrays, and the occasional decorative element like an enormous Ork face welded to the prow. The interior is a maze of cramped corridors, steam pipes, exposed wiring, and the constant background noise of engines that sound like they are about to explode because they usually are about to explode. But these ramshackle vessels can, and do, engage Imperial Navy warships in combat, and sometimes win. They are typically well armed, with broadsides that favor sheer volume of fire over precision targeting. They are tough, their haphazard construction creating layers of armor that can absorb damage in ways that more uniform hull plating cannot. And they carry enormous numbers of boarding troops, because Orks much prefer to close with an enemy vessel, ram their ship into its hull, cut their way through the armor, and then fight the crew in hand-to-hand combat through the corridors, which is exactly the kind of fight that Orks are best at. Let me also spend some time on the individual characters and warlords who have shaped Orc history beyond just Gazkul, because they illustrate the remarkable range of personality and capability that exists within a species that outsiders often dismiss as uniformly stupid. Consider Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, one of the most successful Bad Moon's war bosses in recent history. Nazdreg is notable not for his personal combat prowess, though that is considerable, but for his business acumen. He runs one of the most profitable freebooter operations in the galaxy, maintaining a fleet of warships that hire out to other war bosses for a share of the loot. Nazdreg understands economics, logistics, and market dynamics in a way that most orcs cannot comprehend, and he uses this understanding to maintain a level of personal wealth that makes even other Bad Moons envious. Then there is Tusker the Demon Killer, a Goth war boss who is perhaps the most quintessentially orc figure in the entire setting. Tusker developed a taste for fighting demons after a chance encounter with a chaos-corrupted world, and he found the experience so enjoyable that he decided to take his entire army straight into the Eye of Terror to find more demons to fight. This is the equivalent of learning that sharks are dangerous and deciding to jump into the ocean with a stake tied to your chest. But for Tusker, it was the most logical decision in the world. Tusker's forces rampaged across demon worlds within the Eye of Terror, were fighting and dying and having the time of their lives, until eventually they attracted the attention of Khorne, the chaos god of war and bloodshed. Khorne, impressed by the sheer, unbridled violence of the Orcs' assault, transported Tusker and his army to his own domain within the realm of chaos. There, at the base of Khorne's brass citadel, Tusker's Orcs fight an eternal battle against the Blood God's greatest demonic generals. They die each day, torn apart by creatures of pure malice and rage, and each dawn, Khorne resurrects them so they can fight again. For most species, this would be an eternity of unimaginable torment. For Tusker and his boys, it is paradise, an infinite fight against the toughest enemies imaginable, with no consequences for dying and a fresh start every morning. Somewhere in the realm of chaos, Tusker the Demon Killer is probably grinning right now. And we should also acknowledge Captain Badruk, the most infamous freebooter in the galaxy. Badruk is a Bad Moon who was so ostentatious, so wealthy, and so obnoxiously flashy that even other Bad Moons could not stand him, which is really saying something for a clan that considers gaudiness to be a virtue. Expelled from his clan, Badruk took to the stars as a pirate, and he has never looked back. His personal weapon, the Ripperkustum Mega Blaster, is one of the most powerful personal firearms in the Orc arsenal, a weapon so overcharged and overbuilt that it routinely melts through its own casing after a few shots. Badruk simply has his mech boys build him a new one each time, because that is the kind of thing you can afford when you are the richest pirate in the galaxy. What these individuals, Nazdreg the businessman, Tusker the demon fighter, Badruk the pirate king, represent the remarkable diversity of the Orc species. They are not interchangeable brutes. They are individuals with distinct personalities, motivations, and approaches to the fundamental Orc question of how best to engage in violence. And they exist within a society that, for all its apparent chaos, is remarkably effective at producing exactly the kind of leadership it needs, exactly when it needs it. There is also the more recent phenomenon of the beast snaggers, a subculture of Orcs that has emerged with growing prominence in the current era. Beast snaggers are Orcs who have rejected much of the technology-dependent warfare that characterizes modern Orc armies, instead embracing a more primitive, a beast-riding approach to combat that harkens back to the earliest days of Orc civilization. They ride enormous squigogs, reptilian beasts bred for war, and they hunt great monsters across the galaxy's most dangerous worlds, proving their worth through acts of individual bravery, rather than relying on the volume of fire approach that most Orc armies favor. The emergence of the beast snaggers is significant because it demonstrates something important about Orc society. which is its ability to generate cultural variation and specialization in response to changing conditions. The beast, snaggers, are not a deviation from orc norms. They are a new expression of the same genetic programming that produces goths and evil sons and death skulls, a variant that emerged because the conditions of the current galaxy favor a particular type of warfare. But the orc genome is still producing new specialists, still adapting, still evolving, 60 million years after its creation. That is remarkable, and it should be alarming. Now, let us also expand on the Armageddon Wars with some additional detail that reveals the sophistication of Ghazghkul's approach and the terrifying effectiveness of orc combined arms warfare at its best. The 57 years between the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon were not idle ones for the war boss. Ghazghkul spent that time waging campaigns across dozens of worlds, each one serving a dual purpose, gathering more orcs to his banner and refining his understanding of warfare. He studied his defeat on Armageddon, such as it was, and drew conclusions that would have surprised any Imperial commander who still believed that orcs were incapable of learning from their mistakes. He recognized that the Second War had failed, not because his army lacked strength, but because it lacked staying power. The Imperium's ability to call in reinforcements from across the sector had tipped the balance at a critical moment, and the fragmentation of his army after the rumor of his death had allowed the humans to defeat the orcs in detail rather than having to face them as a unified force. For the Third War, Ghazghkul would address both of these weaknesses. When he returned to Armageddon, he came with a force that was not just larger but better organized. Multiple diversionary attacks pinned down Imperial reserves across the sector. His assault was multi-pronged, on hitting the planet from several orbital approach vectors simultaneously. He deployed rocks, hollowed-out asteroids packed with orc warriors, and equipped with crude but effective thruster systems, as both kinetic bombardment weapons and troop delivery systems, crashing them into the planet's surface to establish instant fortified beachheads. The Third War also saw an unprecedented deployment of orc heavy armor. Dozens of stompers and several full-sized gargants were deployed, their massive weapons providing fire support that matched or exceeded anything the Imperial Guard's artillery could deliver. These war machines were not deployed randomly. They were concentrated at key points in the orc advance, providing the breakthrough capability that the infantry alone could not achieve against the heavily fortified hive cities. In the void above Armageddon, the orc fleet fought a prolonged campaign against Imperial Navy forces that was characterized by a level of tactical sophistication that surprised many Imperial commanders. Rather than simply charging headlong at the Imperial battle line, which was the expected orc naval doctrine, the fleet deployed screening forces of smaller vessels to absorb the initial volley of macro cannon fire, while the heavier orc capital ships maneuvered into boarding range. Once alongside the Imperial vessels, the orcs launched boarding actions with devastating efficiency, their warriors pouring through breached hulls in numbers that overwhelmed even the Navy's dedicated boarding defense teams. The ground war settled into the grinding stalemate that would define the Third War for years. Yes, the Imperium deployed some of its most elite forces to Armageddon, including multiple Space Marine chapters, Titan legions, and the Armageddon Steel Legion at full strength. The fighting was brutal, constant, and seemingly endless, with both sides trading territory back and forth across the ash wastes and through the industrial districts of the contested hive cities. It was during this phase that Ghazghkul made the decision that would define the next chapter of galactic history. He looked at the stalemate on Armageddon, and he saw it not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a distraction from his true purpose. The visions from Gork and Mork had shown him something bigger than one world, bigger than one campaign, bigger than anything any orc warboss had attempted since the beast himself. Armageddon was important, but it was not the end goal. It was a stepping stone. During the campaign, there was one final incident worth recounting, because it reveals something essential about the relationship between Ghazghkul and Yarrick, and about the orc psyche in general. During the period between the Second and Third Wars, Ghazghkul had actually captured Yarrick. The war boss had attacked a world called Golgotha, knowing that Yarrick would come to its defense and had laid a trap specifically designed to take the old commissar alive. The trap worked. Yarrick was captured and brought before Ghazghkull in chains. Any other species, any rational enemy, would have executed Yarrick immediately. He was the most effective human commander the Orks had faced, the one individual most responsible for their defeat on Armageddon, and keeping him alive served no strategic purpose whatsoever. But Ghazghkull is not any other species, and the Orks do not operate on the principles of rational strategic calculus. After a few weeks of what might generously be called interrogation, Ghazghkull released Yarrick. He decided the old human was too much fun to kill, too worthy an adversary to waste. Better to let him go. Let him gather his strength and fight him again when the stakes were higher and the battle more glorious. This decision baffled Imperial intelligence analysts who tried to understand it through the lens of human strategic thinking. But it makes perfect sense within the Ork worldview. The fight is the thing. The fight is always the thing. Killing your best enemy is a waste of a perfectly good fight. Now let us also consider the Ork-Tyranid dynamic in the Octarius sector, because this conflict illuminates one of the most terrifying aspects of the Ork threat, their ability to grow stronger in direct response to the challenges they face. Ghazghkull, in what may have been a deliberate strategic move, or may simply have been a desire to start a really good fight, directed a massive Ork force into the path of Tyranid hive fleet Leviathan. The resulting conflict has become a self-sustaining ecological disaster of galactic proportions. The Orks fight the Tyranids, and the fighting makes the Orks bigger, tougher, and more numerous. The Tyranids consume the dead Orks, absorbing their biomass and genetic material, and use it to produce new, more dangerous bioforms adapted to fight Orks. As the new Tyranid bioforms push the Orks to grow even larger and fight even harder, which produces more biomass for the Tyranids, which produces more dangerous bioforms, and so on, in an escalating spiral of mutual enhancement that shows no sign of reaching equilibrium. The Imperium initially viewed the Octarius conflict as a net positive, reasoning that two dangerous enemies fighting each other was better than either of them fighting the Imperium. This assessment has been revised. The problem is that whoever wins the Octarius war, and it is increasingly clear that this conflict must eventually produce a winner, the victor will emerge from the crucible of combat as something far more dangerous than either species was when the war began. The Orks that survive Octarius will be the biggest, toughest, most battle-hardened greenskins in the galaxy, tempered by years of constant warfare against one of the most adaptable and relentless enemies in existence. The Tyranids that survive will have absorbed an enormous quantity of Ork biomass and genetic material, potentially giving them access to the Orks' remarkable regenerative abilities and combat-linked growth mechanisms. Either outcome is catastrophic for the Imperium, and the most likely outcome, given the Orks' ability to regenerate their numbers through spore reproduction, is an Ork victory that produces a battle-hardened green horde of unprecedented size and ferocity, already organized for war and looking for the next fight. Let us also touch on a topic that is often missed in discussions of the Ork threat, their effect on other species' strategic resources. The Imperium of Man maintains its military capabilities through a system of manufacturing, logistics, and recruitment that is already stretched to the breaking point by the multiple existential threats it faces. Every regiment committed to fighting Orks is a regiment that cannot be deployed against Chaos or the Tyranids. Every warship lost in an engagement with an Ork fleet is a warship that will take years or decades to replace. Every world lost to an Ork invasion is a world whose industrial output and population will never again contribute to the Imperial war effort. The Orks, by contrast, pay no meaningful cost for their wars. They have no factories that can be bombed, no supply lines that can be cut, no civilian population that can be terrorized into submission. Every Ork is simultaneously a soldier, a factory worker, and a supply depot. Their weapons grow with them. Their ammunition is manufactured on the spot from whatever materials are available. Their food comes from the fungal gardens that sprout wherever they go. their reinforcements grow from the ground beneath their feet. This asymmetry is devastating over long timescales. The Imperium can win 100 battles against the Orks and still find itself weaker than when it started, because each victory cost resources that cannot be easily replaced. The Orks can lose 100 battles and still find themselves stronger than when they started, because each defeat scattered spores that will produce the warriors for the 101st battle. Over centuries, over millennia, this arithmetic is fatal. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of erosion wearing down a mountain. The Orks are not going to conquer the galaxy in a single decisive campaign. They are going to wear it down, battle by battle, world by world, generation by generation, until there is nothing left that can resist them. And they have been doing exactly this for 60 million years. This is the strategic reality that most discussions of the Ork threat fail to adequately convey. The Orks are not just a military problem. They are an entropic force, a species-level mechanism for converting order into chaos and civilization into rubble. They do not build empires because they do not need empires. They do not conquer territory because territory is irrelevant to them. They simply fight and fight and fight. And in the fighting, they grow stronger, while everything around them grows weaker. In a galaxy where every other major power is either declining, fragmenting, or consuming itself from within, the Orks are the only faction that is genuinely, measurably, objectively getting stronger with each passing century. That is not a coincidence. That is the intended function of a species that was designed by the greatest bioengineers in the history of the universe to be the ultimate survivor, the last one standing when everything else has fallen. There is another layer to Ork society that we should explore, because it reveals just how rich and complex this civilization truly is beneath its apparently crude exterior. And that is the phenomenon of Ork subcultures, of the specialized groups within Ork society that pursue particular approaches to warfare with an intensity and dedication that borders on religious devotion. We have already discussed the 6 great clans and the various odd boys that provide specialist skills. But within and across these structures, there exist distinct subcultures that cut across clan lines and create their own hierarchies, traditions, and identities. The speed freaks are perhaps the most visible of these subcultures. These are Orks who have developed an absolute obsession with velocity, an addiction to the sensation of moving as fast as physically possible, preferably while making as much noise as possible and shooting at things while doing so. Speed freaks are found in every clan, though they are most common among the evil sons. And they spend every spare moment tinkering with vehicles, racing each other across whatever terrain is available, and arguing about whose buggy is faster. The speed freak obsession goes beyond mere preference. It is a genuine compulsion, a need that drives these Orks to take risks that even other Orks consider unreasonable. A speed freak will strap a rocket engine to a wheeled chassis with no brakes, no safety features, and barely functional steering, and then drive it at maximum speed across broken terrain in the middle of a battlefield, laughing the entire time. The fact that a significant percentage of speed freaks die in crashes rather than combat does nothing to discourage the others. If anything, it adds to the appeal. On the battlefield, speed freaks form the fast attack elements of Ork armies, are racing ahead of the main force in swarms of buggies, bikes, and improvised vehicles that serve as mobile weapon platforms. Their role is to scout enemy positions, harass flanks, chase down retreating units, and generally create as much confusion and destruction as possible before the main body of the army arrives. They are shockingly effective in this role, not because their tactics are sophisticated, but because their speed and aggression create a tempo of combat that most enemies struggle to match. Then there are the Storm Boys, who represent one of the more unexpected aspects of Ork society. Storm Boys are young Orks who have rebelled against the anarchic freedom of normal Ork culture by embracing discipline, order, and regimentation. In any other species, this would be a natural and unremarkable expression of youthful conformity. But in Orc society, where the baseline expectation is complete individual freedom to do whatever you want, as long as you can survive the consequences, choosing to march in formation and follow orders is the most radical act of rebellion imaginable. Stormboys organize themselves into squads with proper rank structures, practice drill movements, and maintain their equipment to standards that would be considered acceptable by Imperial Guard sergeants. They wear matching uniforms, or at least attempt to, and they follow their leader's commands with a promptness that other Orcs find deeply unsettling. Older Orcs view the Stormboys with a mixture of confusion, disapproval, and grudging respect, much the way a biker gang might view their teenage son who has decided to join a military academy. The Stormboys' signature equipment is the rocket pack, a crude jet propulsion device strapped to the Orc's back that allows for short, violent leaps across the battlefield. These devices are unreliable, dangerous, and have a significant chance of exploding during use, but they allow the Stormboys to perform rapid airborne assaults that bypass enemy defenses and deliver a squad of angry, disciplined Orcs directly into the heart of an enemy position. The combination of organized assault tactics and complete disregard for personal safety makes Stormboys units surprisingly effective shock troops. Most Stormboys eventually grow out of their rebellious phase and rejoin mainstream Orc society, having gotten the urge for order out of their system. But some never do, and these lifelong Stormboys become the core of elite airborne units that represent some of the most tactically flexible elements in any Orc army. The irony, of course, is that these Orcs who rebelled against the chaos of their society by embracing discipline end up being among the most effective warriors their species can produce, suggesting that the anarchic structure of Orc civilization might actually be less efficient than a more organized alternative. But this is an observation that no Orc has ever made, and that no Orc would ever care about if it were pointed out to them. The Commandos deserve special attention because they challenge the most fundamental assumption that outsiders make about the Orc species, which is that Orcs are incapable of stealth. Commandos are Orcs who have specialized in covert operations, infiltration, sabotage, and ambush warfare. They paint themselves in camouflage patterns. They move through enemy territory without being detected. They set traps and plant explosives, and they strike from concealment with devastating effect. The idea of a stealthy Orc seems like a contradiction in terms. Orcs are large, loud, aggressive, and possessed of a body odor that can be detected from considerable distance. Conventional wisdom says that an Orc is physically incapable of being quiet or subtle. And yet the Commandos exist, and they are effective. How is this possible? The answer, once again, lies in the Gestalt psychic field. If enough Orcs believe that a Commando is sneaky, then the Commando becomes sneaky. The psychic field does not make the Orc physically smaller or quieter, but it does something to the perceptions of those around the Commando, making them less likely to notice the massive green figure creeping toward them through the undergrowth. Imperial troops who have survived Commando ambushes consistently report that they simply did not see the Orcs until it was too late, even when the Orcs were hiding behind cover that should not have been sufficient to conceal them. This is the Gestalt field at its most subtle and most disturbing. It is not just enhancing Orc technology or making their weapons hit harder. It is actively manipulating the perception of non-Orc observers, creating a kind of low-level psychic camouflage that makes it genuinely difficult to detect an Orc that believes itself to be hidden. The implications of this capability are profound and deeply concerning. And if the Orc psychic field can affect the perception of non-Orc species, what else might it be capable of doing to the minds of those who encounter it? Let me also speak about what it is actually like to visit an Orc world, because the physical reality of Orc civilization is something that most people only experience through sanitized tactical reports and abstract strategic assessments. The lived reality is far more visceral and far more illuminating. An Orc settlement, whether it is a small camp on a frontier world or a vast city on one of the great Orc homeworlds, is an assault on every sense simultaneously. The visual landscape is a chaotic jumble of structures built from scavenged materials, each one unique, each one bearing the personal stamp of whatever mechboy or knob decided to build it. Nothing is uniform, nothing is planned. Its buildings lean against each other at impossible angles, connected by walkways and ramps that seem to defy the basic principles of structural engineering. Banners made from whatever cloth was available hang from every surface, painted with crude but energetic symbols that represent clan allegiance, personal achievements, or simply whatever the painter felt like drawing at the time. The sounds are equally overwhelming. The constant clang of metal on metal from mechboy workshops, the roar of engines being tested, raced, or deliberately pushed to the point of explosion, the guttural shouts of orcs, arguing, fighting, and sometimes singing, though the distinction between these three activities is not always clear. The squealing of squigs and the chattering of Gretchen and the deep, rhythmic pounding of drums that serves as the closest thing orc society has to a musical tradition. And the smell. The smell of an orc settlement is something that stays with you. An industrial, organic, overwhelmingly pungent atmosphere that combines the scents of engine oil, fungal growth, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the particular chemical tang of orc explosives. Imperial soldiers who have occupied orc settlements after military operations report that the smell lingers for months, permeating every surface and resisting all attempts at decontamination. But beneath the chaos and the sensory overload, there is a kind of order. The orc settlement functions. Food is produced, weapons are manufactured, vehicles are built and maintained, squigs are bred and herded. Yes, Gretchen managed the logistical infrastructure that keeps the settlement running. The society works, not efficiently by human standards, but effectively by the standards of a species whose primary measure of success is whether there is a good fight available and enough ammo to enjoy it. This functional chaos is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the orcs, because it explains why they have survived for 60 million years, while more seemingly sophisticated civilizations have risen and fallen around them. The orcs do not need infrastructure, they do not need supply chains, they do not need industrial planning or economic theory or resource management. They need fungus, scrap metal, and enemies to fight. Everything else is optional, and everything necessary is provided by the biology and instincts that the old ones hard-coded into their genome millions of years before the first human ancestor climbed down from a tree. This brings us to the religion of the orcs, or what passes for religion in a species that does not really do religion in the way that other species understand it. Orcs believe in two gods, Gork and Mork, and their understanding of these deities is characteristically straightforward. Gork is brutally cunning, Mork is cunningly brutal, or possibly the other way around. The orcs themselves argue about which is which, and this argument has been going on for approximately 60 million years, with no resolution in sight, which suggests either that the distinction is genuinely unclear, or that the argument itself is the point. What matters about Gork and Mork is not whether they exist in a metaphysical sense, but what they represent in a cultural sense. They are the embodiment of the two qualities that the orcs value above all others: strength and cunning. Every orc aspires to be both brutally powerful and cleverly tricky, and Gork and Mork provide the mythological framework for these aspirations. An orc who smashes his enemy with overwhelming force is channeling Gork. An orc who outsmarts his enemy with a clever trick is channeling Mork. Both approaches are equally valid, equally respected, and equally orky. The weird boys, those unfortunate orcs who are born with a heightened sensitivity to the psychic field, have a particularly intense relationship with Gork and Mork. They serve as living conduits for the collective psychic energy of their tribe, channeling the raw power of millions of orc minds into devastating blasts of green-tinged warp energy. A weird boy in the midst of a large orc army is like a lightning rod in a thunderstorm, absorbing the ambient psychic charge until it becomes too much to contain, and then releasing it in a catastrophic discharge that can level buildings, melt tanks, and occasionally tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The power of a weird boy is directly proportional to the number of orcs in the vicinity and the intensity of their emotional state. In peacetime, a weird boy might be merely uncomfortable, plagued by headaches and involuntary psychic discharges that make them unpopular dinner companions. But in the heat of battle, surrounded by thousands of orcs, all feeling the joy and excitement of combat at maximum intensity, a weird boy becomes one of the most powerful psychic weapons in the galaxy, capable of feats that would require a team of trained human psychers to replicate. And here, again, we see the shadow of the Krork. If a single weird boy can channel the psychic energy of a few thousand orcs into devastating displays of power, what would happen if the entire species was unified? What would a weird boy, or whatever the Krork equivalent of a weird boy was, be capable of when drawing on the collective psychic energy of every orc in the galaxy? The answer is genuinely frightening. It might be capable of reshaping reality on a galactic scale, bending the laws of physics through sheer collective belief in a way that would make the Emperor's own psychic abilities look modest by comparison. This is the ultimate threat that the orc species represents. Not their armies, not their technology, not their numbers, but their potential. The orcs are not what they could be. They have never been what they could be, not since the war in heaven ended and the framework that maintained the Krork civilization collapsed. For 60 million years, they have existed in a diminished state, a fraction of their designed capability, and in that diminished state, they have still managed to be one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. If they ever reach their full potential, if Gazkul or someone like him manages to unite the species and trigger the genetic cascade that transforms orcs back into Krork, then nothing in the galaxy as it currently exists will be able to stop them. Not the Imperium, not Chaos, not the Tyranids, not the Necrons, not the Eldar, not all of them together. The Old Ones built the Orcs to win the war in heaven against the Necrons and their Catan masters, beings of godlike power who had conquered the very stars. The Krork were designed to match that level of threat and overcome it. The modern galaxy contains nothing that even approaches the power level of the ancient Necrons at their height, which means that a fully awakened Krork civilization would be facing enemies that are, by the standards of their original design specifications, trivially easy to defeat. This is not speculation. This is engineering. The Orcs were built with specifications that far exceed anything the current galaxy requires. They are an over-engineered solution to a problem that no longer exists. And the surplus capability that is currently lying dormant in their genome represents a potential threat that dwarfs anything else in the setting. There is also the matter of the Orc economy. And yes, the Orcs do have an economy, one that is surprisingly functional despite being based on principles that would give an imperial economist a nervous breakdown. The currency of Orc civilization is teeth, specifically Orc teeth, which are hard, durable, and roughly uniform in size, making them a surprisingly practical medium of exchange. But the truly ingenious aspect of this system is that Orc teeth grow back. An Orc who spends all his teeth today will have a new set growing in within a few weeks. This means that the Orc economy has a built-in inflation control mechanism and a constantly refreshing money supply that prevents any individual from accumulating so much wealth that they destabilize the system. It also means that every Orc is essentially a walking mint, capable of producing currency simply by existing. The implications of this economic system are profound and frequently overlooked. Because Orc teeth eventually decay and crumble when removed from the jaw, savings are impossible. You cannot hoard wealth for the future because your wealth literally disintegrates over time. This forces a perpetual circulation of resources through the economy, ensuring that goods and services are constantly being exchanged rather than being locked away in vaults. An Orc with teeth to spend will spend them. because there is no point in saving what will be worthless in a few months. But this creates a consumer economy of remarkable velocity, with goods changing hands rapidly and mech boys, pain boys, and other specialists staying constantly busy fulfilling orders. The result is an economic system that, despite its apparent primitiveness, is remarkably resistant to the kinds of economic crises that plague more sophisticated civilizations. There can be no banking collapse because there are no banks. There can be no debt crisis because credit does not exist. There can be no currency manipulation because the currency grows in your mouth. The Ork economy is, in its crude way, one of the most stable economic systems in the galaxy, which is both ironic and slightly humiliating for the species that consider themselves more civilized. Within this economy, certain goods command premium prices. Weapons, particularly well-made or unusually destructive weapons, are always in demand. Vehicles, especially fast ones, command high prices among speed freaks. Medical services from pain boys are expensive, but essential, since even orcs cannot survive every wound without assistance, though the definition of medical service in orc society is flexible enough to include procedures that would constitute war crimes under any civilized legal code. And then there are the luxury goods, shiny bits, flashy gubbins, and other decorative items that orcs value for their aesthetic appeal, which is primarily defined by how much noise, light, or smoke they produce. The mechboy workshops that produce these goods are fascinating spaces, equal parts factory, laboratory, and artist studio. A mechboy at work is a sight to behold. He moves with a confidence and purpose that belies the apparent randomness of his methods, selecting parts from enormous scrap heaps with an intuition that the Adeptus Mechanicus would find deeply disturbing. He welds, bolts, hammers, and occasionally threatens his materials into configurations that should not function, but invariably do. The gestalt field hums around him as he works, invisible but palpable, smoothing over the engineering impossibilities and filling in the gaps that his crude tools and cruder understanding cannot bridge. The products of these workshops range from the mundane to the extraordinary. A basic slugger might take a mech boy an hour to assemble from scrap parts. A customized shooter, with all the bells and whistles that a wealthy nob might demand, could take a day or two. A major project, like a battle wagon or a def dread, might occupy an entire workshop for weeks, with the mech boy and his team of Gretchen assistants working around the clock in a frenzy of welding sparks and inventive profanity. But the most remarkable products of orc engineering are the looted vehicles. When orcs capture enemy equipment, and they capture a great deal of it, the mech boys waste no time in converting it to orc specifications. An Imperial Lehman Russ battle tank captured by orcs will be stripped of its original weaponry, fitted with bigger guns, given additional armor plates welded on at random angles, painted in bright colors, and returned to service within days. The resulting vehicle bears little resemblance to the original, but it functions, often better than it did before. It's because the gestalt field enhances its performance in ways that have nothing to do with the modifications the mech boys actually made. Looted vehicles are a particular headache for Imperial forces because they create logistical confusion on the battlefield. A Lehman Russ is supposed to be friendly. The silhouette is familiar, the engine sound is recognizable, and Imperial training programs drill soldiers to identify it as an allied asset. But an orc-looted Lehman Russ looks just enough like the original to cause a moment of hesitation. A fraction of a second where a gunner's finger pauses on the trigger because his training tells him that shape is friendly, even though the red paint and the crude glyph of a leering orc face welded to the turret should make the truth obvious. That moment of hesitation can be fatal. The orcs have looted vehicles from every major faction they have encountered. There are orc-operated Eldar Falcons, stripped of their elegant anti-gravity systems, and placed on crude tracked chassis because the mech boys could not figure out how to make the hover technology work without the Eldar's psychic attunement. There are orc-modified Tau hammerheads, their railguns replaced with oversized orc cannons because the original weapons were too precise and not nearly loud enough. There are even documented cases of orcs looting chaos vehicles, slapping on a fresh coat of paint, and fielding them against the very chaos warband they were taken from, which the orcs considered hilarious, and the chaos marines considered a personal insult of the highest order. This brings us to another often overlooked dimension of orc culture, which is their relationship with art and self-expression. Orcs are, in their own crude way, artists. Every orc weapon is personalized with scratched glyphs, daubed paint, and hammered-in decorations that express the owner's identity, achievements, and aspirations. Every vehicle is a canvas for the mech boy's creative vision, decorated with patterns and symbols that communicate clan affiliation, personal history, and aesthetic preferences. The most elaborate examples of orc art are the war banners that accompany every significant orc force into battle. These banners are painted on whatever material is available, often the hides of defeated enemies or salvaged fabric from captured settlements, and they depict scenes of violence, triumph, and orcish mythology with a raw energy that is, in its own way, genuinely impressive. The colors are bold. The compositions are dynamic, and the subject matter, while invariably centered on fighting, displays a range of artistic approaches that suggests genuine creative diversity within the species. Orc glyphs, the written language of the species, are another example of this creative impulse. Each glyph is a pictographic symbol that represents a concept, an object, or a command, and they are remarkably consistent across orc populations that have had no contact with each other for thousands of years. This consistency comes from the same genetic programming that gives mech boys their engineering knowledge and pain boys their surgical instincts. The orc written language is hard-coded into their DNA, as unchanging and as universal as the instinct to fight. But within this genetic framework, our individual orcs display considerable creative variation in how they render these glyphs. Some are simple and functional, others are elaborate and decorative, incorporating additional elements that express the artist's personality or tell a story beyond the basic meaning of the symbol. The most skilled orc artists, who tend to be older knobs or war bosses with the wealth and leisure to develop their abilities, produce work that is genuinely striking, full of energy and movement, and a kind of brutal vitality that reflects the essential character of the species. This artistic tradition is important because it provides yet another piece of evidence that the orcs are not the mindless brutes they are often assumed to be. A species that produces art, even crude art, is a species that has an inner life. As a species that decorates its weapons and personalizes its vehicles is a species that cares about identity and self-expression. A species that maintains a written language and a visual tradition. Across 60 million years of existence is a species with a culture, a real culture, not just a set of instinctive behaviors. And a species with a culture is a species that can grow. It can develop. It can change. It can become something more than it currently is. The orcs have been roughly the same for millions of years because the conditions have not demanded that they change. But the War of the Beast showed what happens when conditions do change, when a sufficiently powerful leader emerges who can push the species toward its full potential. The culture was there, waiting, ready to support a more sophisticated civilization the moment the genetic triggers were activated. The question is not whether the orcs can become the Krork again. The War of the Beast proved that they can. The question is when, and whether the galaxy will be ready when it happens. Based on everything we have discussed tonight, the answer to the second question is almost certainly no. The Imperium is not ready. The Eldar are not ready. The Tau, the Necrons, the Tyranids, none of them are ready for what a fully awakened orc civilization would mean. And the orcs are always ready. That is, after all, the entire point. And while we are on the subject of the orc threat throughout history, let us not neglect the earliest encounters between humanity and the orcs, because these encounters set the pattern for everything that followed. And they reveal how deeply ingrained the Imperium's underestimation of the greenskins really is. When the Emperor of Mankind launched the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, sending his vast expeditionary fleets out into the galaxy to reclaim the worlds that humanity had settled during the Dark Age of technology, the Orks were among the first alien species that the Imperium encountered. And they were everywhere. Every new sector that the Imperial fleets entered, every cluster of worlds that the expeditionary forces explored, seemed to contain Ork populations of varying sizes and levels of development. Some were primitive, little more than tribal societies on single worlds. Others had grown into multi-system empires with substantial military capabilities. The sheer ubiquity of the Ork species was, in itself, as an early warning sign that the Imperium largely ignored. How was it possible that a single alien race had colonized such an enormous proportion of the galaxy? How had they spread so far, so thoroughly, across so many different environments? The answer, of course, lay in their spore-based reproduction, but the Imperium's understanding of Ork biology was rudimentary during the early Crusade, and the strategic implications of their reproductive cycle were not fully appreciated until much later. The most significant engagement between the Imperium and the Orks during the Great Crusade was the Ullanor Crusade, a massive military campaign directed against the largest concentration of Orks that the Imperium had yet encountered. The Ork Empire, centered on the world of Ullanor, was enormous, spanning roughly 12 star systems and ruled by an overlord named Urlak-Urg, a war boss of such immense size and power that he dwarfed even the largest nobs in his army. The Ullanor Crusade was led by the Primarch Horus of the Lunar Wolves Legion, with substantial support from other legions and Imperial army forces. It was a campaign of tremendous scale and ferocity, requiring months of sustained combat across multiple worlds, before the Imperium finally cornered and defeated Urlak-Urg's forces on Ullanor Prime itself. The victory at Ullanor was celebrated as one of the greatest triumphs of the Great Crusade. It was the occasion of the famous Triumph of Ullanor, a massive celebration at which the Emperor granted Horus the rank of War Master and announced his own retirement from the Great Crusade to pursue other projects on Terra. The symbolism was clear. The Orks, the greatest Xenos threat the Imperium had faced, had been broken. The galaxy was safe. Except, of course, it was not. The Orks at Ullanor had been defeated, but not destroyed. Their spores remained in the soil of every world they had occupied. Their populations on other worlds continued to grow and fight. And, as the War of the Beast would prove 1500 years later, the Orks would return to Ullanor itself, rebuild, and come back stronger than ever. The Ullanor Crusade is instructive because it illustrates the fundamental problem with the Imperium's approach to the Ork threat. The Imperium fights wars of annihilation. Its strategic doctrine is built around the concept of decisive victory, as the complete destruction of the enemy's military capability and the permanent elimination of the threat they pose. This approach works against species that have conventional military forces, centralized command structures, and industrial bases that can be targeted and destroyed. It does not work against the Orks. You cannot achieve a decisive victory against a species that regenerates from spores. You cannot permanently eliminate a threat that is encoded into the planet's soil. You can win the battle, hold the victory parade, rename the conquered world, and declare the campaign a success, and 20 years later, the first squigs will be emerging from underground, and 50 years after that, the Orks will be back in force, and the whole cycle begins again. The Emperor himself recognized this problem during the Great Crusade, though the records suggest he considered the Orks a manageable threat rather than an existential one. He was more concerned with chaos, with the warp, with the dangers that lurked in the Imperium and threatened to corrupt humanity from within. The Orks were dangerous, certainly, but they were physical, material, comprehensible. They could be fought with guns and tanks and space marines. They did not require the metaphysical countermeasures that the war against chaos demanded. This assessment may have been correct in the short term. In the long term, it may prove to be the Emperor's most consequential miscalculation. Because while the Imperium has spent 10,000 years focusing its most powerful resources on the war against chaos, the Orks have been doing what they always do, fighting, growing, spreading, and slowly, imperceptibly, building toward the critical mass that will trigger the next great leap in their evolutionary potential. There is also the matter of the scrap world of Goro in the Telon Reach, which housed an Ork empire that rivaled Ullanor in size and technological sophistication. The Ork mech boys of Goro had developed a form of plasma technology that was unlike anything the Imperium had encountered before or since, capable of generating destructive yields of terrifying potency. The Emperor himself led the assault on Goro, accompanied by Horus and the Lunar Wolves, and even with the Master of Mankind's personal involvement, the campaign was a grinding, costly affair that demonstrated just how dangerous a well-established Ork civilization could be. Let us also spend some time on the freebooters. Yes, because they represent a fascinating and often overlooked dimension of Ork civilization that has significant implications for the broader galactic threat. Freebooters are Orks who have, for various reasons, left their original tribes and clans behind and taken to the stars as independent operators. Some were exiled for crimes against Ork social norms, which, given the extraordinarily broad definition of acceptable behavior in Ork society, requires truly spectacular levels of misconduct. Others simply grew bored with tribal life and struck out on their own in search of new fights and new loot. Whatever their origins, freebooters share a common lifestyle centered on piracy, mercenary work, and the general pursuit of personal enrichment through violence. Freebooter fleets range in size from a single battered escort to vast armadas of dozens of warships, all under the command of a captain who rules through the same might makes right principle that governs all Ork society. The most successful captains accumulate enormous personal wealth, which they display with the kind of ostentatious excess that makes even bad moons look restrained. Huge hats, long coats, gold-plated weapons, and more jewelry than a rogue trader's personal vault are standard freebooter fashion. What makes the freebooters strategically significant is their role as a kind of Ork irregular force that operates independently of the larger tribal structures. Freebooter fleets can appear anywhere in the galaxy, attacking shipping lanes, raiding frontier worlds, and generally causing chaos in areas that the Imperium considers secure. They provide a constant, low-level Ork threat that ties down patrol fleets and garrison forces, draining Imperial resources even in sectors that are far from any major Ork empire. Freebooters also serve as a vector for the spread of Ork populations to new worlds. A freebooter raid on a previously Ork-free world deposits spores on its surface, and even if the raiders are driven off or destroyed, the seeds of a future Ork infestation have been planted. Over centuries, this process has resulted in Ork populations appearing on worlds that have never been the target of a deliberate Ork invasion. Worlds in the heart of Imperial space, in sectors that were thought to be completely secure. Now, let us deepen our comparison of the Ork threat against the other major galactic powers, because I think a systematic analysis reveals just how uniquely dangerous the Green Menace truly is. Against the forces of chaos, the Orks possess several decisive advantages. First, and most importantly, the Orks are virtually immune to chaos corruption. The Gestalt psychic field that suffuses Ork society operates on fundamentally different principles than the warp energies that power chaos, and Ork minds are simply not structured in a way that allows the dark gods to gain purchase. An Ork cannot be tempted by promises of power, because the Ork already has everything it wants: a good fight and a bigger chopper. An Ork cannot be seduced by Slanesh, because the Ork's pleasures are too simple and too physical for the Prince of Pleasure to manipulate. An Ork cannot be driven to rage by Horn, because the Ork is already as angry as it wants to be, and it is channeling that anger exactly where it wants it to go. Even Nurgle and Sench find little purchase in a species that does not fear death and does not dream of the future. This immunity to chaos corruption is extraordinarily significant. Every other major faction in the galaxy is vulnerable to chaos in some way. The Imperium loses soldiers, worlds, and even entire Space Marine chapters to corruption. The Eldar live in constant fear of Slaanesh's hunger for their souls. Even the Tau, who have little warp presence, have found themselves vulnerable to chaos influence at the edges of their empire. But the Orks? The Orks fight demons the same way they fight everything else, with enthusiasm, with joy, and with absolute zero interest in whatever bargains the demon might be offering. Tusker the Demon Killer is the perfect embodiment of this principle, an Ork who charged straight into the heart of chaos itself and came out the other side having a wonderful time. Against the Tyranids, the Orks possess the unique advantage of being able to match the hive fleets in the one dimension that makes the Tyranids most dangerous: attrition. Most species that face the Tyranids are fighting a losing war from the start, because the Tyranids consume the biomass of their fallen enemies and use it to produce more warriors. Every battle feeds the hive fleet, and every victory costs the defender resources that cannot be replaced. The mathematics are inexorable. The Tyranids grow stronger with each engagement while their enemies grow weaker. But the Orks do not follow this pattern. The Orks reproduce through spores, not through biomass consumption, which means that an Ork population can replenish its losses independently of the resources available on the battlefield. The Tyranids cannot consume an Ork world and move on, because the Ork spores in the soil will produce new Orks, who will fight the Tyranids all over again. The self-sustaining cycle of Ork reproduction creates a permanent source of resistance that the Tyranid consumption model is not designed to overcome. Furthermore, the Orks' combat-linked growth means that extended warfare against the Tyranids actually makes the Orks more dangerous, not less. The survivors of each engagement are bigger, tougher, and better adapted to fighting Tyranid bioforms. This is the escalation spiral that we see playing out in the Octarius sector, where both species are locked in a mutual arms race that is producing increasingly powerful warriors on both sides. The Imperium expected this conflict to weaken both species. Instead, it is forging them into something worse. Against the Necrons, the Orks represent a fascinating mirror image. Both species have their origins in the war in heaven. Both were created or modified to be the ultimate warriors of their respective creators. Both have survived for 60 million years in various states of dormancy or diminishment. But where the Necrons are declining, their tomb worlds failing, their dynasties fragmenting, their silent kings struggling to unite a species that has lost much of its former glory, the Orks are ascending. Every century sees more Orks, more bigger Orks, more technologically sophisticated Orks. The Necrons are a spent force trying to recapture their past. The Orks are a sleeping giant that is slowly waking up. The Necrons possess superior technology, certainly. Their Gauss weapons, their living metal bodies, their mastery of inertialess drive systems and dimensional displacement all place them ahead of the Orks in a direct technological comparison. But the Necrons cannot reproduce. They cannot replace their losses. Every Necron warrior destroyed is one that cannot be replaced, and their tomb worlds contain a finite number of dormant warriors that, once awakened and destroyed, are gone forever. The Orks have no such limitation. They are effectively infinite, a species that produces more of itself as a natural byproduct of its existence, and that cannot be permanently diminished by any amount of military force. Against the Eldar, the contrast is even more stark. The Eldar are a dying race, their numbers dwindling with each passing century, their craft world's fragile island in an increasingly hostile galaxy. The Eldar possess knowledge, foresight, and psychic ability that far outstrips anything the Orks can match on an individual level. A single Eldar Farseer can see the future with a clarity that allows for strategic planning centuries in advance. A single Eldar Warlock can unleash psychic devastation that would require thousands of Ork weirdboys to replicate. But the Eldar cannot afford losses. Every Eldar who dies in combat is irreplaceable. a unique individual whose knowledge and experience are lost forever. The Orks can afford any loss because the loss is temporary. I kill 1,000,000 Orks, and 1,000,000 more will grow from their spores. The Eldar know this, and it colors every interaction they have with the Green Menace. When the Eldar look at the Orks, they do not see a primitive species to be pitied or dismissed. They see the instrument of their eventual extinction, a species that will still be fighting and growing and laughing long after the last craft world has gone dark, and the last Eldar soul has been claimed by the hungry god that stalks them. The Eldar Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, perhaps the most powerful psyker of his race, has been recorded as expressing particular concern about the Ork threat. During the War of the Beast, Eldar forces actually assisted the Imperium in combating the Ork invasion, not out of any love for humanity, but out of a recognition that a fully awakened Ork civilization would be dangerous enough to threaten even the Eldar. Eldrad is said to have had visions of Gaz-Kul Mag Uruk Thraka thousands of years before the Warboss's birth, and to have feared that Gaz-Kul might succeed where the beast failed. Against the Tau, the youngest of the galaxy's major spacefaring civilizations, the Orks represent an almost insurmountable challenge. The Tau rely on superior technology, disciplined fire warriors, and careful strategic planning to overcome enemies that outnumber and outmatch them physically. All three of these advantages are negated by the Ork threat. The Orks' Gestalt field allows their crude technology to match or exceed Tau engineering in practice, if not in theory. Whilst the Orks' sheer numbers can overwhelm any defensive formation, no matter how well disciplined. An Ork behavior is so chaotic and unpredictable that careful strategic planning is essentially useless against them. The Tau have had several encounters with Ork forces on the borders of their expanding empire, and these encounters have uniformly been among the most difficult and costly campaigns the Tau have ever fought. The Tau's philosophy of the greater good, which assumes that all rational beings can be persuaded to join a cooperative society through demonstration of its benefits, founders completely when applied to a species that does not value cooperation, does not recognize benefits, and considers the concept of rational behavior to be a strange and slightly offensive idea. Each of these comparisons tells the same story. The Orks may not be the most powerful individual fighters in the galaxy. They may not possess the most advanced technology. They may not have the most sophisticated strategies or the most far-reaching plans. But they have something that no other species can match. They have endurance. They have persistence. They have the ability to keep coming, keep fighting, keep growing, long after every other species has exhausted its resources and its will. In the short term, almost any major faction can defeat the Orks in a given battle or campaign. In the medium term, most factions can contain the Ork threat within manageable limits, though at an ongoing cost that drains resources from other priorities. But in the long term, measured in centuries and millennia rather than years and decades, the Ork threat is the only one that is guaranteed to grow rather than diminish. Every other faction in the galaxy is fighting entropy in some form, whether it is the slow decline of the Eldar, the bureaucratic stagnation of the Imperium, the fragmentation of the Necron dynasties, or the self-destructive nature of chaos. The Orks are not fighting entropy. The Orks are entropy, a force of nature that breaks down complex structures and reduces them to their simplest components, which the Orks then use to build more Orks. That is the final and most profound argument for the Orks as the real threat in Warhammer 40,000. Not their armies, though those are formidable. Not their technology, though that is more dangerous than most realize. Not their numbers, though those are staggering. The real threat is their patience, their persistence. There's their absolute, unbreakable determination to keep doing what they have always done, for as long as there are stars to fight under and enemies to fight against. The Orks have been at war for 60 million years. They show no signs of stopping, and the longer the war goes on, the stronger they get. That is a truth that bears repeating, and one that should inform everything we discuss from here forward. But all of this analysis, all of these comparisons and projections and historical precedents can feel abstract. It can feel like numbers on a page, like strategic assessments read in the comfort of a well-defended command bunker far from the front lines. So let us ground ourselves in the concrete reality of what the Ork threat actually looks like when it arrives on your doorstep. Or let us talk about what happens when the green tide makes planetfall and the fighting begins in earnest, because the reality of Ork ground warfare is something that no amount of theoretical analysis can adequately prepare you for. The first thing you notice, according to the accounts of Imperial Guard veterans who have survived engagements with large Ork forces, is the sound. Not the gunfire, though that comes quickly enough. Not the roar of engines or the crash of explosions, though those are present in abundance. No, the first thing you notice is the sound of the Orks themselves. Thousands of them, tens of thousands sometimes, all bellowing at the tops of their lungs as they charge across open ground toward your defensive positions. It is not a battle cry in the human sense, not a coordinated shout designed to intimidate the enemy or bolster the spirits of the attackers. It is something more primal than that, a collective expression of joy, so intense that it borders on ecstasy. The Orks are not screaming because they are angry or afraid. They are screaming because they are happy, genuinely, unreservedly, deliriously happy. Because they are about to do the thing that their entire species was built to do, and every cell in their bodies is celebrating the fact. The second thing you notice is the speed. Orks are faster than they look, much faster, and a charging Ork mob can close the distance between firing positions with an acceleration that catches inexperienced defenders off guard. An Ork in full sprint covers ground at a pace that would be impressive for a human athlete. And the Ork is doing it while carrying weapons that weigh more than some humans, while wearing crude armor that adds dozens of pounds to its already considerable mass, while being shot at by everything the defenders can bring to bear. They just keep coming. Some fall, most do not. And those that reach the defensive line hit it with the force of a biological battering ram. 300 pounds of muscle and bone and fury slamming into whatever stands in their way. The third thing you notice, and this is the detail that haunts survivors long after the battle is over, is the sheer physicality of close combat with an Ork. Humans fight with weapons, with technique, with training. Orks fight with their entire bodies. They punch, they kick, they bite, they headbutt, they grab defenders by the limbs and simply tear them apart through brute force. A single Ork boy, the most basic infantry unit in the Ork army, is stronger than an unaugmented human by a factor of 3 or 4. A Nob is stronger by a factor of 10, and a warboss is strong enough to rip a tank hatch off its hinges and pull the crew out with his bare hands. This is not an enemy that can be negotiated with. This is not an enemy that can be demoralized or intimidated. This is not an enemy that will stop because you have hurt it or frightened it or shown it the futility of its position. This is an enemy that was designed, from the cellular level up, to do nothing but fight and to love every second of it. And that is why the Orks are the real threat, not because of any single capability or any particular advantage, but because they are the one enemy that will never, ever, ever stop coming. Before we delve into the darkest chapter in the Imperium's history with the Orks, let us spend a moment appreciating the sheer mechanical insanity that Ork ingenuity can produce when the Gestalt field and the frenzied creativity of mech boys come together. Because you cannot truly understand the threat the Orks pose without understanding the weapons they bring to bear. And those weapons, from the smallest chopper to the most titanic gargant, tell a story of impossible engineering and terrifying effectiveness that defies everything the Adeptus Mechanicus holds sacred. At the most basic level, every Ork warrior carries a chopper and a slugger. The chopper is exactly what it sounds like, a large, crude bladed weapon designed for one purpose, hitting things very hard. It might be a cleaver, it might be an axe, as it might be a jagged piece of industrial scrap metal with a handle welded to one end. Whatever its form, it is invariably heavy, sharp enough to do real damage, and built to survive being swung into ceramite armor at full force by an orc who weighs 300 pounds and does not know the meaning of the word restraint. The slugger is a large caliber pistol, roughly equivalent to a hand cannon, that fires solid slugs with enough force to punch through standard issue Imperial Guard flak armor at close range. Neither weapon is sophisticated. Both are devastatingly effective. But these are just the starting point. As we move up the scale of orc weaponry, things get progressively more creative, more dangerous, and more fundamentally impossible. The shooter is the standard orc ranged weapon. A fully automatic firearm that fires a stream of large caliber rounds at a rate that would make an Imperial heavy stubber look restrained. Shooters come in an almost infinite variety of configurations, because every mech boy who builds one does so according to his own instincts, and whatever materials happen to be lying around at the time. Some have multiple barrels. Some have drums that hold thousands of rounds. Some have been modified with crude sighting mechanisms, though these are typically ignored by the orc wielding the weapon, who prefers to fire from the hip while running headlong toward the enemy. The volume of fire that a mob of orc boys can lay down with their shooters is genuinely impressive, and while the accuracy of individual rounds is poor, the sheer number of projectiles in the air at any given time means that accuracy becomes somewhat academic. Enough darts at a board, and some of them will find the bullseye. Big shooters and def guns represent the heavy weapons of the orc infantry, capable of suppressing enemy positions and tearing through light vehicles with sustained bursts of fire. Rocket launchers provide anti-armor capability, launching crude but effective explosive projectiles that can crack open the hull of a Lehman Russ battle tank if they hit in the right spot. And for those orcs who prefer to solve their problems with fire, burners provide a portable flamethrower capability that is especially effective in the close quarters fighting that orcs prefer. Then there are the specialist weapons that only mech boys of particular skill and ambition can create. The shock attack gun is perhaps the most infamous, a device that opens a temporary tunnel through the warp and fires a stream of terrified snotlings through it, depositing them inside enemy vehicles and fortifications. The snotlings, driven mad by their brief exposure to the raw stuff of the Imperium, immediately begin tearing apart whatever they find themselves inside, which can range from the interior of a tank to the interior of a Space Marine's power armor. The weapon is wildly unpredictable, sometimes depositing the snotlings in completely the wrong location, sometimes fusing them with the target at a molecular level, and occasionally simply imploding and taking the mech boy operating it along for the ride. But when it works, it is devastating. Worse, the custom force field is another mech boy invention that has no right to function but does so anyway. It projects a bubble of protective energy around the mech boy and any nearby orc units, absorbing or deflecting incoming fire with varying degrees of reliability. How it actually works is a mystery that has stumped Mechanicus researchers for centuries. The device appears to be constructed from random bits of metal, cable, and occasionally bits of dead squig, and yet it produces an energy field that can stop lasfire, bolter rounds, and sometimes even heavier ordnance. The best explanation anyone has ever come up with is the Gestalt field, but that just raises more questions than it answers. Moving up the scale, we reach the vehicles. Orc vehicles are, without exception, the most visually distinctive machines in the galaxy. Where Imperial vehicles are standardized, mass-produced, and maintained according to strict Mechanicus protocols, Orc vehicles are unique creations, each one a one-of-a-kind rolling disaster, built from whatever the mech boy could steal, scavenge, or rip off of a dead enemy. No two trucks look the same. No two battle wagons share the same layout. Every vehicle is a testament to the individual creativity of its builder and the collective madness of the species that uses it. Trucks are the basic transport vehicles of the Orc army, open-topped, fast, loud, and capable of carrying a mob of boys into the thick of the fighting at speeds that would terrify anyone with a functioning sense of self-preservation. They are built for speed rather than protection, which is fine by the orcs who ride them, since they consider the journey to the fight to be almost as much fun as the fight itself. A truck full of bellowing orcs barreling toward an enemy position at full speed, guns blazing, and passengers already halfway over the sides in their eagerness to get stuck in, is one of the most terrifying sights a defending soldier can see, and it is a sight that soldiers across the galaxy see far too often. Battle wagons are the heavy transports, massive armored vehicles that can carry several mobs of boys along with their associated knobs and big guns. They are typically built from the hulls of captured enemy vehicles, with additional armor plates, weapons, and decorative elements welded on, until the original vehicle is completely unrecognizable beneath layers of scrap metal and spiky bits. The front of a battle wagon usually sports a massive ram or roller designed to crush anything in its path, and the top is bristling with guns, operated by enthusiastic but poorly trained Gretchen crews. A column of battle wagons advancing on a position sounds like an industrial accident and looks like a junkyard having a bad day, but the amount of firepower and close combat potential they deliver is no laughing matter. Warbikes are a particular favorite of the Evil Sons clan, and the broader cult of speed, the subculture of orcs, who are addicted to the sensation of velocity in the same way that other orcs are addicted to the sensation of punching things. These massive two-wheeled machines are powered by oversized engines that produce more noise than thrust and more smoke than either. But they carry their riders into battle at extraordinary speed while providing a stable platform for twin-linked weapons. A mob of warbikers sweeping across a battlefield in a V formation, engines screaming and guns chattering, can disrupt enemy formations, overrun artillery positions, and generally cause the kind of chaos that orcs find deeply satisfying. And then there are the buggies. The shock jump dragster teleports across the battlefield in short, random jumps. The Boomdaka Snazwagon is a mobile weapons platform that trades armor for sheer volume of fire. The Rucker Truck Squig Buggy launches living ammunition in the form of explosive squigs, which bite down on whatever they hit and then detonate. The Megatrack Scrapjet is essentially a fighter aircraft that has been bolted to a tank chassis, thus creating something that can neither fly nor drive with any particular competence, but compensates with raw firepower and the kind of aggressive unpredictability that makes enemy commanders want to retire. But all of this, impressive and terrifying as it is, pales in comparison to the true war machines of the orc race, the walkers, the titans, the gargants. Killer Khans are the smallest of the orc walkers, piloted by a single Gretchen that has been sealed inside a metal canister equipped with weapons and stompy legs. The Gretchen pilots are typically volunteers, though their understanding of the word volunteer may have been influenced by the mech boy holding a wrench over their heads at the time of recruitment. Despite their relatively small size, Killer Khans are dangerous opponents, and combining the unpredictability of a panicked Gretchen with the firepower of a heavy weapons platform and the crushing weight of a metal bipedal walker, Def Dreads are larger and considerably more dangerous. These are orc-sized combat walkers that require their pilot to be cybernetically hardwired into the machine, a process that requires the combined expertise of a mech boy and a pain boy, and that the patient does not always survive. Those who do survive emerge as something between an orc and a machine, a consciousness trapped inside a walking weapons platform that can mount up to 4 arms, each ending in either a powerful close combat weapon or a heavy gun. Many orcs volunteer for Def Dread conversion because the resulting machine makes them one of the biggest and most powerful warriors in their tribe, which is all the motivation any self-respecting orc needs. Gorkanauts and Morkanauts are massive combat walkers that stand as tall as a 3-story building and are armed with an array of weapons that can threaten anything short of a super-heavy tank. Named after the twin orc gods, these machines are piloted by orcs who have become obsessed with the gathering energy of a massive military campaign and are driven to find the biggest, most destructive machine they can and use it to cause as much mayhem as possible. A Gorkanaut favors heavy melee weapons and a forward assault style, while a Morkanaut relies more on ranged weapons and the custom force field that protects it and nearby units. Both are devastating on the battlefield, and both serve as potent symbols of Ork might that inspire nearby greenskins to even greater acts of violence. But the true pinnacle of Ork engineering, the machines that represent the ultimate expression of mechboy ambition, and the closest thing the Orks have to a religious artifact, are the Gargants. And the Gargants deserve our full attention because they are the machines that have, on more than one occasion, turned the tide of wars that determined the fate of entire sectors. A Gargant is an Ork titan. There is no more accurate way to describe it. These are machines that stand as tall as Imperial Warlord or even Imperator-class titans, towering walking fortresses of scrap metal and fury that dominate any battlefield they appear on. They are built in the rough likeness of Gork or Mork, or sometimes both, and they are viewed by the Orks not just as war machines but as physical manifestations of their god's power. Building a Gargant is the ultimate ambition of any big mech, and the construction process is itself a catalyst for the gathering of a great military campaign. When a big mech begins constructing a Gargant, the project draws Orks from across the surrounding region like a magnet. Other mech boys come to contribute their skills. Boys come because the promise of a Gargant means that a serious fight is brewing. Knobs come because where there are lots of boys, there are opportunities for advancement. And war bosses come because a Gargant building project is the surest sign that someone is organizing the kind of massive campaign that every self-respecting war boss wants to be part of. The weapons mounted on a Gargant depend entirely on what the mech boy who built it had available and what particular vision of destruction drove them during the construction process. A typical Gargant, if such a thing can be said to exist, might sport a def cannon, an enormous ballistic weapon that fires shells the size of small vehicles with enough force to shatter fortification walls and cripple enemy titans. It might also carry a super Gatler, a ridiculously oversized Gatling cannon that can sweep away infantry formations like a broom clearing dust. One arm typically ends in a massive close combat weapon, either a mega chopper chainsaw the size of a building crane or a power claw capable of ripping open the armor of another titan. And scattered across its hull are numerous smaller weapons, rocket launchers, flamers, and anti-personnel guns operated by Gretchen crews who clamber through the Gargant's interior like mechanics inside a submarine. Compared to Imperial Titans, Gargants are cruder, less well-armored, and have shorter-ranged weaponry. But they have advantages that the elegant machines of the Adeptus Titanicus cannot match. They are absurdly dense in construction, layers upon layers of scrap metal, welded and bolted together in a way that creates a kind of spaced armor effect, with each layer absorbing some of the energy of incoming fire before the next layer takes over. They do not suffer from the catastrophic plasma reactor meltdowns that can destroy an Imperial Titan from within, though they are admittedly vulnerable to fires and ammunition explosions. And they can be built from literally anything, requiring no specialized components, no sacred machine spirits, no centuries-old manufacturing techniques. If you have enough scrap metal and a big mech with a vision, you can build a Gargant. The Imperium cannot say the same about its titans. And at the largest scale, there are the Mega Gargants, machines so immense that they rival the Imperator-class titans that serve as the god machines of the Adeptus Titanicus. These are tracked rather than bipedal, essentially mobile fortresses bristling with weapons of every conceivable type, and they are deployed only in the largest and most important campaigns. The construction of a Mega Gargant is an event of tremendous significance in Ork culture, a project that can take years and consume the resources of an entire planet. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, the Orks constructed war machines that went even beyond the Mega Gargant. The Temple Gargant encountered on Ullanor during the climactic battle of that war was described as being of unprecedented size and power, a walking fortress cathedral dedicated to Gork and Mork that dwarfed anything the Imperium had seen before. It took the personal intervention of the Primarch Vulcan to bring it down, and the resulting explosion seemed to obliterate both the machine and the Primarch himself. And that brings us, at last, to the War of the Beast. The conflict that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the Orks are not just a nuisance, not just a persistent problem, not just another Xenos species to be managed. The War of the Beast proved that the Orks are an existential threat to the Imperium of man, capable of threatening the very heart of human civilization, capable of nearly doing what even Horus could not. Let me set the scene. It is the middle of the 32nd millennium. Roughly 1500 years have passed since the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne following the Horus heresy, and the Imperium is doing surprisingly well. The traitor legions are licking their wounds in the eye of terror. The major Xenos threats have been pushed back to the fringes of Imperial space. The economy is growing, the military is strong, and for the first time in over a millennium, the citizens of the Imperium are enjoying something that might actually be called peace. This era is remembered by Imperial historians as the time of rebirth, and it was characterized by a general atmosphere of complacency that, in retrospect, was probably the most dangerous thing about it. The High Lords of Terror bickered among themselves about trade rights and political influence. The Space Marine chapters, split into smaller organizations following the Horus heresy, were increasingly used as glorified security guards rather than the elite strike forces they had been designed to be. The Imperial Navy, under the command of Grand Admiral Lansong, had been redeployed to the far borders of Imperial space, leaving the core worlds relatively undefended. And the Orks, those crude, disorganized barbarians who had been thoroughly beaten at Ullanor during the Great Crusade. Nobody was really paying attention to the Orks. That was the mistake. In 544 of the 32nd millennium, something went wrong on the world of Ardamantua in Segmentum Solar. It had just 6 weeks of warp travel from Terra itself. The Imperial Fists, one of the most storied Space Marine chapters in the Imperium's history, had been dispatched to deal with what was thought to be a routine alien infestation. The aliens in question were a species called the Chromes, insectoid creatures that were behaving erratically, almost as if they were running from something. They were running from the Orks. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong was the appearance of gravitational anomalies in the Ardamantua system. Then the planet began to shake. Earthquakes split the surface. The sky darkened. And then, phasing into reality with a process that the Imperium's scientists could not explain, and the Imperium's admirals could not counteract, an enormous object materialized in orbit above Ardamantua. And it was roughly the size of a small moon, and it was covered in Ork structures. The Imperium would come to call these objects attack moons. The Orks had somehow mastered gravity manipulation technology to such a degree that they could move planetoid-sized objects through space, phase them in and out of normal reality, and use them as mobile battle stations capable of devastating entire systems. This was not the crude scrap metal technology that the Imperium was accustomed to dealing with. This was advanced engineering on a scale that stunned the Adeptus Mechanicus, who had to confront the deeply uncomfortable possibility that the Orks were not only capable of matching Imperial technology, but, in some areas, had surpassed it. The Imperial Fists were virtually annihilated. Their fleet was destroyed. Their chapter master was killed in the fighting. When the dust settled, only a single survivor remained, Captain Corland, the last surviving Imperial Fist. And it got worse, much worse. The attack moon above Ardamantua was not unique. More attack moons began appearing across the Imperium, phasing into reality above world after world, their gravity weapons devastating planetary defenses, and their legions of massive Orks deploying to the surfaces below. These were not the normal-sized Orks the Imperium was used to fighting. These Orks were enormous, bigger and more physically imposing than anything anyone had seen since the days of the Great Crusade. Their weapons were sophisticated and reliable. Their tactics were coordinated and effective. And they were everywhere. Entire sectors fell. Communication networks collapsed. Space Marine chapters that moved to intercept the Ork forces were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the invasion. The Ultramarines found themselves fighting desperately to defend their home worlds of Ultramar. The Space Wolves, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard were all bogged down in their own campaigns and unable to come to Terra's aid. And then, an attack moon appeared over Terra itself. Think about that for a moment. An Ork war machine the size of a small moon, hovering in the sky above the throne world of the Imperium of Man, above the Imperial Palace, above the Golden Throne where the Emperor sat in eternal vigil. The citizens of Terra looked up and saw a cratered, weapon-studded sphere of alien rock and metal hanging over their heads, and they panicked. Riots broke out across the planet, cults dedicated to worshipping the beast. As the mysterious Ork warlord behind the invasion had come to be known, sprang up among the terrified populace. The High Lords of Terra, those supposed paragons of imperial leadership, dissolved into infighting and finger-pointing as the crisis overwhelmed their ability to respond. But the most shocking moment of the entire war, the moment that truly shattered the Imperium's complacent assumptions about the Ork race, came when an Ork ambassador arrived at the Senatorum Imperialis on Terra itself. An Ork diplomat, speaking in coherent, grammatically correct, Low Gothic, delivering terms of surrender to the High Lords of Terra. The ambassador was not a crude, bellowing brute. It was articulate. It was calm. It was, in its own alien way, civilized. And the terms it delivered were not unreasonable by the standards of galactic warfare, which made them all the more terrifying, because they implied a level of political sophistication that the Imperium had never imagined possible in an Ork. The High Lords did not accept the terms, of course, but the damage to Imperial prestige was incalculable. Here was proof, standing in the very heart of human civilization, that the Orks were capable of far more than the Imperium had ever given them credit for. They could build advanced technology. They could develop complex military strategies. They could field diplomats. They were not just brutes. They were a civilization, one that was older than the Imperium by 60 million years, and one that had, in the span of a few short years, brought the mightiest human empire in history to the brink of annihilation. The war that followed was one of the most desperate and costly conflicts in Imperial history. Captain Corland, the last Imperial Fist, enacted a protocol known as the Last Wall, calling together the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists to reform into a single fighting force. The Death Watch, the Imperium's premier Xenos hunting organization, was created during this conflict specifically to counter the Ork threat. The Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition was established for the same reason. The Imperium eventually discovered that the beast's homeworld was Ulanor, the same world where Horus had defeated the Orks during the Great Crusade 1500 years earlier. The Orks had returned to Ulanor and, over the intervening centuries, built a civilization of unprecedented sophistication. The planet was covered in well-organized Ork cities. While its military forces were structured and disciplined, its technology was advanced beyond anything the Imperium had expected. 3 separate Imperial invasions of Ulanor were required to finally defeat the beast. The first ended in near disaster. The second seemed to succeed when the Primarch Vulcan confronted the beast in single combat within the massive temple Gargant and apparently destroyed both the machine and its occupant in a tremendous explosion. But the beast survived, or more accurately, it was revealed that the beast was not a single Ork, but a collective of 6 Primorks, each one a being of almost inconceivable size and power, and killing one merely weakened the others without ending the threat. It took a third invasion, utilizing every remaining resource the Imperium could muster, including the newly created Death Watch and the few remaining Sisters of Silence, to finally bring down the remaining beasts and end the war. The cost was staggering. The Imperial Fists chapter was effectively destroyed, its entire roster of Space Marines killed during the fighting. Captain Corland, the last original Imperial Fist, died on Ulanor. Billions of Imperial citizens had been killed. Entire sectors had been devastated. The political structure of the Imperium was in shambles, with the High Lords having demonstrated their total inability to handle a crisis of this magnitude. And the most disturbing legacy of the War of the Beast was not the death toll, or the destroyed worlds, or the shattered chapters. It was the realization, slowly dawning on the more perceptive minds within the Imperium, that this could happen again. Yet the beast had shown what was possible when orcs gathered in sufficient numbers and were led by a warlord of sufficient vision. The encoded potential of the Krork, dormant for millions of years, had begun to reassert itself, producing orcs of enormous size, sophisticated technology, and political complexity that had not been seen since the war in heaven itself. If it happened once, it could happen again. And next time, the Imperium might not be lucky enough to survive. Now let us leap forward through the millennia, past the slow recovery from the War of the Beast, past the gradual ossification of the Imperium into the bureaucratic nightmare it would become, past the first hints of the Great Rift that would eventually tear the galaxy in two. Let us arrive at the late 41st millennium, where the most dangerous orc alive is preparing to do something that could make the War of the Beast look like a warm-up exercise. Let us talk about Gazakul Maguruk Thraka. The story of Gazakul begins on a world called Urk, a name that may or may not have influenced his own, roughly 9 years before the Second War for Armageddon. At this point in his life, Gazakul was nobody special. He was a lowly orc boy, one of countless millions serving in the armies of the Death Skull's war boss Dregmek. He was unremarkable in every way that orcs measure worth. Not particularly big, not particularly tough, not particularly cunning. Just another green face in the crowd. Then a Space Marine strike force raided Urk. The exact chapter has been the subject of some debate, though the Dark Angels have been suggested as likely candidates. Yes, the Space Marines were attempting to disrupt the Ork forces that were building on the planet, a preemptive strike intended to prevent a larger problem from developing later. During the fighting, a bolter round struck Gazakul in the head. The impact destroyed approximately 30% of his skull and pulped a significant portion of his brain. By any reasonable medical assessment, this should have killed him. It should have been the end of a very short and entirely unremarkable orc life. But the orcs are not reasonable, and their medicine is not bound by the same limitations as human science. Gazakul was found by a pain boy of considerable infamy, a figure known as Mad Doc Grotznik. Grotznik rebuilt Gazakul's shattered skull with plates of adamantium, patching the damage with the crude but effective surgical techniques that pain boys instinctively possess. The operation was a success, in the sense that Gazakul survived and regained consciousness. But something had changed. The brain damage, or the adamantium plates, or some combination of the two, had done something to Gazgakul's mind that went far beyond simple recovery. Gazgakul began having visions. He claimed that the orc gods, Gork and Mork themselves, were speaking to him directly, showing him images of a galaxy consumed by green fire, of orc armies beyond counting sweeping across the stars, of a war so vast and so glorious that the gods themselves would tear their way out of the warp to participate in it. Gazgakul declared himself the prophet of Gork and Mork, the chosen instrument of the orc god's will, and he began to act with a sense of purpose and direction that is extraordinarily rare among the orc race. Now, whether Gazkul's visions are genuine divine communication, a manifestation of his connection to the Gestalt psychic field, or simply the result of traumatic brain injury and delusions of grandeur, is a question that nobody can definitively answer. What is not debatable is their effect. Within 6 years of his injury, Gazakul had risen from a common boy to the war boss of his tribe. He had united the various competing factions on Urk under his banner through a combination of personal combat, strategic cunning, and the sheer force of his personality. And when Urk's sun began to die, threatening the planet with radiation and eventual destruction, Gazakul seized the opportunity presented by the arrival of a massive space hulk in orbit and loaded his entire growing army aboard, setting sail for the stars. The space hulk, a conglomeration of wrecked ships fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, was renamed by Gazakul and set on a course through the Imperium. The journey was not easy. The power systems failed multiple times, and the orcs had to fight off continuous demonic attacks during the crossing. But these hardships only served to toughen the army and weed out the weak. so that by the time the Hulk arrived at its destination, Ghazghkull commanded a battle-hardened force of orcs who had already proven themselves in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Their destination was Armageddon. Armageddon is a hive world, one of the Imperium's most important industrial planets, with a population numbering in the tens of billions and an industrial output that supplies countless Imperial Guard regiments and military campaigns across the sector. It was exactly the kind of target that would produce the biggest, most satisfying fight imaginable, which is, of course, exactly why Ghazghkull chose it. The Second War for Armageddon began in 941 of the 41st Millennium, when Ghazghkull's Space Hulk arrived in the system. The Hulk's weapons demolished the system's orbital defenses, including outdated satellites and small attack craft. Desperate messages were sent calling for aid, and 3 Space Marine chapters began organizing a response, but they could not arrive before the Orks made landfall. A month later, the Orks landed, and Armageddon became a hell of warfare on a planetary scale. Ghazghkull's forces swept across the planet with terrifying speed and coordination. Hive cities fell. Manufacturing complexes were overrun. The planetary defense forces, though they fought bravely, were simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Ork assault. For a time, it seemed as though Armageddon would be lost entirely. It was during this campaign that the other key figure in this story emerged. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, an aging Imperial officer who had been stationed on Armageddon, and who would become the single most important human opponent Ghazghkull has ever faced. Yarrick rallied the defense of Hive Hades, one of the planet's major population centers, and through a combination of tactical brilliance, personal bravery, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, managed to hold the Hive against repeated Ork assaults. The legend of Yarrick grew during this campaign. The Orks, who respect strength and ferocity above all things, became convinced that Yarrick could kill with a glance, a belief that was not entirely unfounded, since Yarrick had at some point acquired an Ork power claw to replace a hand he lost in combat, and had also been fitted with a bionic eye that could fire a laser beam. The fact that the Orks believed these things about Yarrick may have actually enhanced his effectiveness, given the Gestalt field's tendency to make Ork beliefs into reality. It is an ironic possibility that the Orks' own psychic power may have made their most hated enemy more dangerous. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. 3 Space Marine chapters descended on Armageddon and helped turn the tide. Ghazghkull's forces were pushed back, though not destroyed. Rumors of the war boss's death spread through the Ork ranks and caused many to break and flee, but Ghazghkull himself was not killed. Whether through divine intervention, as his followers claimed, or simple cunning, as his detractors suggested, the war boss escaped off-planet and disappeared into the void. But Ghazghkull did not see the Second War for Armageddon as a defeat. He saw it as a learning experience, a necessary step in a much larger plan that had been revealed to him by Gork and Mork. Armageddon was not the end. It was only the beginning. 57 years to the day after the start of the Second War, Ghazghkull returned. The Third War for Armageddon was launched with an even larger force, and this time the Orks were better prepared, better equipped, and better organized. Ghazghkull had spent the intervening decades not in idleness, but in preparation, conquering world after world, absorbing tribe after tribe into his growing army and refining his tactics with each campaign. The Third War for Armageddon was, and in many ways still is, one of the largest and most devastating conflicts in the late 41st millennium. Billions have died. Entire regions of the planet have been reduced to wastelands. The fighting has ebbed and flowed, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Space Marines, Imperial Guard regiments, and Titan legions have all been deployed, and all have found the Orks to be a relentless, seemingly inexhaustible foe. But perhaps the most significant development of the Third War came not on the battlefield, but in Ghazghkull's own mind. The war boss became bored with the stalemate on Armageddon. The war was grinding, attritive, lacking the explosive, decisive quality that Gork and Mork's vision demanded. And so Ghazghkull did something that stunned both his followers and his enemies. He left. He delegated the war on Armageddon to his subordinate Nobs and departed the planet entirely, setting off into the galaxy to pursue what he called the Great Green Crusade. His vision had expanded beyond a single world, beyond a single sector, beyond anything that any Ork war boss had attempted since the beast himself. Gazg-Kul was going to unite every Ork in the galaxy under a single banner. He was going to gather the greatest gathering of greenskins since the War in Heaven. He was going to launch a crusade that would shake the foundations of reality itself and force Gork and Mork to manifest physically in the material universe to join the fight. Commissar Yarrick, driven by a combination of duty and personal obsession, followed Gazg-Kul into the void, determined to kill the war boss before his plans could come to fruition. The chase has continued across years and light years, with Yarrick always one step behind and Gazg-Kul always one step ahead, the two locked in a rivalry that has taken on almost mythological proportions. And Gazg-Kul is succeeding. That is the truly terrifying part. Everywhere he goes, Ork tribes fall into line behind him. War bosses who have ruled their own empires for centuries submit to his authority or are destroyed. The Great Green Crusade is growing, and its momentum is building with each passing year. Estimates suggest that Gazg-Kul has already brought a staggering percentage of the galaxy's Ork population under his direct or indirect control, and the number grows with every battle, every conquest, every world that falls to the green tide. The Great Rift, the massive warp storm that has torn the galaxy in two following the events of the 13th Black Crusade, has only accelerated this process. The Orks see the Great Rift not as a disaster, but as an opportunity, a sign from Gork and Mork that the greatest fight in history is about to begin. In the chaos and confusion that has followed the splitting of the galaxy, Ork activity has surged to unprecedented levels, with more great crusades rising simultaneously than at any other point in recorded history. And at the center of it all is Gazg-Kul, growing larger with every battle, his legend spreading through the Ork collective consciousness like wildfire, his army swelling into something that the galaxy has not seen in living memory. He is, by any measure, the most dangerous Ork alive, and there is a genuine, terrifying possibility that he is on the verge of achieving something that no Ork has achieved since the beast, the unification of the entire Ork race under a single banner, for a single purpose: war. And now we arrive at the question that has been building throughout this entire discussion. The question that we posed at the very beginning, that has been gathering evidence and momentum like an Ork army gathering for battle. The question that, I believe, has only one honest answer: are the Orks the real threat in Warhammer 40,000? Well, to answer this properly, we need to compare the Orks to the other major threats that the galaxy faces, and we need to be honest about what each of those threats can actually do. Let us start with chaos. The forces of chaos, the traitor legions, the demon hordes, the cults and the corrupted are undeniably dangerous. They have access to the power of the warp itself. They can corrupt and subvert enemy forces from within, and their greatest champions possess power that can match or exceed that of the Imperium's finest warriors. The Horus Heresy nearly destroyed the Imperium, and the 13th Black Crusade succeeded in tearing the galaxy in half. But chaos has fundamental weaknesses that limit its ultimate threat potential. The Chaos Gods are locked in eternal conflict with each other, and their followers reflect this division. Khorne despises Slaanesh. Tzeentch works against Nurgle. The forces of chaos spend almost as much time fighting themselves as they do fighting the Imperium, and every grand alliance eventually collapses into backstabbing and betrayal. Chaos also requires thinking beings to sustain it, since the warp is powered by the emotions and psychic energy of the galaxy's sentient races. If chaos actually succeeded in destroying all life, it would destroy itself in the process. The forces of chaos are therefore self-limiting in a way that the Orks are not. What about the Tyranids? The Great Devourer, the hive fleets that sweep across the galaxy, consuming every scrap of biological matter in their path. The Tyranids are certainly terrifying. They are numerous beyond counting. They adapt rapidly to any threat. And they possess a collective intelligence that can coordinate millions of organisms across vast distances. The hive fleets that have already entered the galaxy are believed to be merely the advanced scouts of a much larger force that is still in transit from whatever distant place the Tyranids originated. But the Tyranids have weaknesses too. They are purely biological, which means they can be stopped by removing their biomass. They have no technology in the conventional sense, no industry, no civilization. Their hive mind, while powerful, can be disrupted by severing the psychic links that connect individual organisms, and they are, ultimately, a consuming force rather than a creating one. They do not build, they do not settle. They devour a world and move on, which means that while they can destroy civilizations, they cannot truly replace them. The Necrons. They possess technology that puts every other race to shame. They are functionally immortal, and they ruled the galaxy once before. But they are also fractured, their dynasties locked in their own internal conflicts, and many of their tomb worlds still slumber, their occupants lost in the confusion of millions of years of dormancy. The Necrons are a potential threat rather than an active one, and their greatest era of power lies in the distant past rather than the present. Now consider the Orks against all of this. The Orks have no internal divisions that cannot be overcome by a strong enough leader. When Gazkul says, "Follow me," the Orks follow, because that is what they are programmed to do. There are no theological disputes, no competing visions for the future, no ideological conflicts. There is only the fight, and everyone agrees on the fight. The Orks cannot be eradicated. Kill every last Ork on a planet, and the spores will produce more. The Tyranids can consume biomass, but Ork spores have been found thriving in environments that the Tyranids have already stripped bare. The Orks are not just numerous, they are functionally indestructible as a species. The Orks grow stronger the more you fight them. Every conflict makes them bigger, tougher, and more technologically sophisticated. The Imperium's standard approach to threats, overwhelming military force, is exactly what feeds the Ork war machine. Fighting the Orks is like punching tar. The harder you hit, the more stuck you get. The Orks possess a psychic ability that is, in some ways, more versatile and more dangerous than the powers of chaos. And the Gestalt field can enhance technology, heal wounds, inspire courage, and subtly alter the physical properties of objects. And unlike chaos, it has no cost. There is no corruption, no mutation, no soul-devouring price to pay. The power is free, it is always on, and it scales directly with the number of Orks present. And finally, the Orks have something that none of the other major threats possess. They have the latent potential of the Krork. The genetic code that made them 12-meter-tall killing machines with Imperium-tier technology still exists in every single Ork alive today. It is dormant, waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. The War of the Beast proved that those conditions can be met. Gazkul may be in the process of meeting them again. Consider the scenario. Gazkul succeeds in his Great Green Crusade. He unites the Orks of the galaxy under a single banner. The collective Gestalt field, powered by trillions of greenskins, all focused on a single purpose, reaches a level of intensity not seen since the War in Heaven. The latent Krork genetics begin to reactivate. The Orks begin to grow. Their technology begins to advance. Their society begins to organize. Within a generation, the galaxy is not facing a horde of squabbling barbarians. It is facing a unified civilization of 12-meter-tall warriors, wielding technology that makes the Imperium's best look like sharpened sticks, backed by a psychic field that can literally reshape reality, propagated by a reproductive system that cannot be stopped short of sterilizing every planet they have ever touched. That is the real threat. Not the Orks as they are now, though even in their current, diminished state, they are arguably the most numerous species in the galaxy and have come closer to destroying the Imperium than almost any other foe. The real threat is the Orks as they could be, the Orks as they were designed to be. The weapon that the Old Ones built to fight the greatest war in the history of the universe, a weapon that has been on standby for 60 million years, slowly ticking over, waiting for someone to turn the key. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka may be that key. And if he turns it, if the Great Green Crusade reaches its culmination and the Orks begin their ascent back toward their ancestral form, then nothing in the galaxy, not the Imperium, not Chaos, not the Tyranids, not the Necrons, not all of them combined, will be able to stop what comes next. There is a reason that the Eldar, and who have seen more of the galaxy's history than any other living species, regard the Orks with a particular kind of quiet, horrified respect. An elder Farseer once observed that when a human kills an Ork, the human celebrates. But the Eldar is wise enough to notice that the Ork died with a grin on its face, because the Ork got exactly what it wanted. It got a fight, and whether it won or lost that fight is, from the Ork perspective, largely irrelevant. What matters is that the fight happened. What matters is that somewhere, in the soil beneath the battlefield, the spores are already settling. What matters is that the next generation is already on its way. You can fight the Orks. You can even beat the Orks. But you cannot end them. They are the galaxy's oldest war, a conflict that began before the stars were in their current positions, and that will continue long after every empire currently standing has crumbled to dust. They are the green tide, the eternal enemy, the fight that never stops, the war that was designed to outlast everything else. And the Orks would not have it any other way. There is one more aspect of the Ork threat that I want to explore before we move to our final assessment, and that is the psychological dimension. Because the Orks do not merely pose a military threat to the species they fight against. They pose a psychological threat as well, one that is subtle, insidious, and often more damaging than the physical violence itself. When a human soldier first encounters the Orks in battle, the initial reaction is almost always shock. Not fear exactly, though that comes later. Shock. Because the Orks violate every expectation that a trained soldier brings to the battlefield. They do not behave the way enemies are supposed to behave. They do not take cover when shot at. They do not flee when their leaders fall. They do not become demoralized when they take casualties. They do not surrender. They do not negotiate. They do not stop. They laugh. An Ork charging through a hail of gunfire, watching its comrades fall beside it, taking wounds that would drop a human soldier twice over, is laughing. It is having the time of its life. It is experiencing, in that moment of blood and noise and violence, the purest joy that its species is capable of feeling. The fight is not a burden to be endured. It is a gift to be savored. And that disconnect between the horror that the human soldier is experiencing and the ecstasy that the Ork is experiencing is profoundly disturbing on a psychological level. Imperial Guard soldiers, who have survived extended campaigns against the Orks, frequently report a particular form of combat stress that the Departamento Munitorum's Medici officers have come to recognize as a distinct condition. The soldiers describe a feeling of futility, a sense that nothing they do matters, because the Orks simply do not care. Kill 10 of them, and 20 more come running, just as eager, just as enthusiastic, just as absolutely delighted to be there. Hold a position for days against relentless assault, and when you finally break through the Ork lines, you find that the Orks on the other side are building a new settlement, are already planting the seeds of the next generation, already preparing for the next fight, with no apparent awareness that they just lost the last one. This psychological effect is not accidental. It is a direct consequence of the Orks' emotional programming, another gift from the Old Ones. The Orks were designed to never stop, never give up, never become discouraged. They were designed to be happy in war, because a species that is happy in war will never choose peace, will never seek compromise, will never decide that the cost of continued fighting is too high. The psychological resilience of the Ork species is just as much a weapon as their physical toughness or their psychic field, and it is aimed not at the Orks' enemies' bodies, but at their minds. There is also the matter of orc humor to consider. One, because it plays a more significant role in the orc threat than most people realize. Orcs have a sense of humor. It is crude, violent, and centered almost entirely on physical comedy, specifically the kind of physical comedy that involves other beings being hurt or embarrassed. An orc will find it hilarious when a fellow orc's weapon explodes in his hands. An orc will cackle with glee when a charging enemy trips over a hidden wire and falls face first into the mud. An orc will find it the funniest thing in the world when a captured prisoner tries to escape and runs straight into a wall. This humor serves a social function within orc society, reinforcing group bonds and diffusing tensions that might otherwise lead to serious infighting. But it also has a strategic effect on their enemies, because it makes the orcs seem clownish, absurd, well, not to be taken seriously. A human commander who sees orcs fighting in their colorful, chaotic, seemingly disorganized way is naturally inclined to dismiss them as a lesser threat compared to the disciplined precision of Chaos Space Marines, or the cold, relentless efficiency of Necron phalanxes. The orcs look silly. They sound silly. Their weapons look like they were built by children. Their vehicles look like they should not be able to move, let alone function as effective war machines. And that dismissiveness, that natural human tendency to underestimate what seems foolish, is a trap. It is a trap that the orcs did not set deliberately, because they do not think in those terms. But it is a trap nonetheless, and it has claimed more Imperial commanders than any deliberate orc stratagem ever could. The orcs do not need to be taken seriously in order to be dangerous. They do not need to be respected in order to kill you. They do not need to look impressive in order to tear through your defense lines and butcher everyone behind them. And by the time a commander realizes that the green tide rolling toward his position is not the disorganized mob it appears to be, but a terrifyingly effective, combined arms force backed by psychic enhancement and 60 million years of genetic optimization for exactly this kind of violence, it is usually too late to do anything about it. I want to leave you with a final thought, a scenario that is not hypothetical, but is, based on the trajectory of current events, increasingly likely. Picture this. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka completes his Great Green Crusade, where every major orc empire in the galaxy acknowledges his authority. The fractured, squabbling, disorganized green masses that have plagued the galaxy since the end of the War in Heaven are, for the first time in 60 million years, unified under a single command structure. The Gestalt psychic field, powered by trillions of greenskins, all focused on the same purpose, reaches an intensity not seen since the days of the Krork. The changes begin slowly at first. Orc war bosses who were already large begin to grow even larger, their bodies responding to the unprecedented psychic energy by activating dormant genetic sequences that have lain unused for millions of years. The mech boys begin to build things that they have never built before, guided by instincts that are suddenly clearer and more specific than they have ever been, drawing on genetic knowledge that was encoded by the old ones for situations exactly like this one. The orc language begins to grow more complex, developing new words and grammatical structures that allow for the expression of concepts that the orcs have never needed before, but that are suddenly relevant. Within a generation, the orcs are no longer the diminished, devolved remnants of the Krork. They are the Krork, 12 meters tall, wearing sophisticated power armor, wielding weapons that can match or exceed anything in the galaxy. Organized, disciplined, purposeful, and utterly, completely, joyfully dedicated to a single objective: war. On a scale that the galaxy has not seen in 60 million years. That is what sleeps in the green tide. That is what lurks behind the crude accents and the ramshackle technology and the seemingly endless parade of slapstick violence. The orcs are not declining. They are not stagnating. They are not holding steady. They are building, slowly, steadily, incrementally. They are building towards something that the galaxy is not prepared for. The War of the Beast showed us what a partially awakened Orc civilization can do. It took the Imperium to the brink of extinction and permanently altered the structure of its government and military, and the beast's Orcs were only partway through the reactivation process. They had diplomats and gravity weapons, but they were still far short of the Krork's full potential. Next time, if there is a next time, the process may go further. The Orcs may reach a level of development that no one alive today has ever seen, that no record in any archive can adequately describe, that was last witnessed when the old ones still walked among the stars and the galaxy was young. And the most chilling detail of all is this: the Orcs will not see it as a transformation. They will not experience it as an awakening or an evolution or a return to glory. They will simply continue being Orcs, fighting, building, growing, laughing, having the time of their lives as they always have, as they always will, as they were designed to do forever and ever, until the last star burns out and the galaxy falls silent. But the silence will not last, because somewhere in the cold dark between the dead stars, there will be spores, and from those spores, new fungal gardens will grow. And from those gardens, new squigs will emerge, and then snotlings, and then Gretchen, and then, finally, inevitably, unstoppably, the Orcs. And the whole thing will start all over again. That is the Orcs. The real threat in Warhammer 40,000, not the loudest threat, not the most dramatic threat, not the threat that makes the best stories or generates the most fear, but the oldest threat, the most persistent threat, the most fundamentally ineradicable threat, the one that was here before everything else and will be here after everything else is gone. The green tide does not rise and fall, it just rises, and it never stops. Now, as we bring this journey to a close, let us take a moment to consider what all of this means for the current state of the galaxy. Because the situation right now, as of the opening of the 42nd Millennium, one is more dangerous than it has been at any point since the War of the Beast. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in two, severing communication and travel routes that the Imperium has relied upon for 10,000 years. Worlds that were once firmly under Imperial control are now cut off, isolated, vulnerable. The forces of chaos are rampant, launching offensives from the rift that have stretched Imperial military resources to the breaking point. The Tyranid hive fleets continue their advance from multiple directions, consuming worlds and growing ever larger. The Necrons are awakening in greater numbers, their ancient tomb worlds stirring to life after millions of years of slumber. And in the midst of all this chaos, all this destruction, all these overlapping crises, the Orcs are thriving. Because this is exactly the kind of galaxy that Orcs were built for. A galaxy at war is an Orc paradise. Every conflict, every battle, every desperate last stand fuels the Gestalt field, feeds the growth cycle, and draws more Orcs out of whatever corners of the galaxy they have been hiding in. Ghazkul's Great Green Crusade continues to gain momentum. Reports from across the galaxy speak of Orc activity at levels not seen in living memory. Crusades that would have been major events in their own right are erupting simultaneously across multiple sectors, each one led by a war boss who has been inspired or directly subjugated by Ghazkul's growing legend. The Octarius sector, where Ghazkul engineered a collision between Orc forces and Tyranid hive fleets, has become a crucible of escalating violence that is producing Orcs of ever-increasing size and ferocity, battle-hardened by constant combat against one of the most dangerous enemies in the galaxy. And here is the detail that should keep every Imperial strategist awake at night. The Orcs are not declining. They are not being worn down. They are not being gradually pushed back by the combined efforts of the Imperium and its reluctant allies. They are growing, in numbers, in size, in technological sophistication, in organizational complexity. Every war the Imperium fights against any enemy leaves behind worlds where orc spores have been deposited by previous infestations. Every sector that falls into chaos or is cut off by the Great Rift becomes a breeding ground for orc civilizations that will grow unchecked until they burst outward in a new green crusade. The orcs are the galaxy's background radiation, the constant, ever-present, slowly intensifying green glow that everyone has learned to ignore because it has always been there. But background radiation, left unchecked, can reach lethal levels. And the orc radiation is building. There is an old saying attributed to an Imperial Guard officer whose name has been lost to history, but whose words have been preserved in the archives of the Departamento Munitorum. He said that the orcs are the only enemy that you can defeat 1,000 times and still lose the war, because for them, every battle is a victory, win or lose, because every battle makes them stronger. Us and stronger is all they have ever wanted to be. He was right. And if the galaxy does not wake up to that reality, if the Imperium and every other civilization continues to treat the orcs as a secondary concern, a sideshow to the grander threats of chaos and the Tyranids and the Necrons, then one day, perhaps sooner than anyone expects, the green tide will rise to a height that cannot be stemmed. And on that day, the galaxy will learn what the old ones knew 60 million years ago. The orcs are not a problem to be solved. They are a force of nature, as inevitable and as implacable as gravity itself. And they were built to be the last ones standing when everything else has fallen. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And the orcs are war incarnate. That is all for tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Green Menace, the galaxy's most persistent and most underestimated threat, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these kinds of deep, immersive explorations of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If there is a topic you would like me to cover next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your suggestions are what keep this channel going. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, the orcs are always closer than you think.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.